Chapter 31:43. He did not know how much more the sixth level of the Tao Master's path had expanded beyond his range of perception. Follow? Dream? Calm. These areas that had just been discovered by Luo Fan were not that special. They were not fundamentally different from the areas that Luo Fan had known before. The cultivators there were no different from the previous ones. Perhaps, in those cultivators' perception, the sixth level of the Tao Master's path had always been what they had sensed. There was no deeper concealment, which was in line with their own logical expectations for the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Just like Luo Fan before, if it was an ordinary existence, Luo Fan would naturally not think so. He would inevitably think that there was a barrier between concealment and unconcealment, and that what he saw was a different world and a different area. However, it was obvious that in the Tao Master's path, the situation was obviously not like this, because the one who controlled everything was not an ordinary existence, but a true saint. The means of a true saint could even silently distort his cognition, so that he could not see the truth and see the real Tao Master's path. How could the method be so clumsy? Only when everyone's perception was within their own cognitive range could they interact with each other normally, but in terms of cognition, there would be some differences in the details of the Tao Master's path, which made their cognition of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path in line with their logic and even in line with their way of cultivation. Only in this way could it be worthy of the level of a true saint's means. Is this the real sixth level? No, this is just the sixth level that I know now. Luo Fan looked at the almost new sixth level of the Tao Master's path, and such a thought flashed in his mind. At this moment, he truly felt the inconceivability of the Tao Master's method. Even the setting of the Tao Master's path, which seemed to have no hidden mysteries, had such incredible settings and hidden so many unimaginable mysteries. Then, what about the others? What about the other cultivation points? What about the various cultivation environments? What about the natural landscapes? What about the clusters of worlds and worlds? What about the many truths and mysteries hidden in the depths of nothingness? With this association, he felt that the world in front of him had suddenly become incomparably vast. Previously, he did not care about the path of Tao Master, but at this moment, it had disappeared without a trace. That's right. Before this, Luo Fan had already given up on the Tao Master's path. The reason for this was not because he was too arrogant and conceited, but because he had obtained all sorts of information from the true sage about the path of going against the flow of time. He had placed the focus of his cultivation on the great calamity. After all, the true divine had clearly said that for those who walked the path of the reverse, the great tribulation was the focus of cultivation and the key to improving. Apart from that, everything else was to prepare for the great tribulation's cultivation. They were all building a foundation for cultivation during the great tribulation. It was all for the sake of obtaining the qualifications to step into the great tribulation. With this understanding, how could he still care about the cultivation of the Tao Master? Naturally, he would not care about the Tao Master's path at all. It was like a person who knew that something was just a transition to something better. Knowing that a house was just a temporary place to live for a better house, then how much would he cherish that thing in that house? How much importance would he attach to it? Obviously, that kind of cherishing and that kind of importance could not be much. As for things, because they knew that it was a transition and would soon be abandoned, it was naturally impossible to cherish it as if it was their own treasure. It could be said that if they could use it, they would use it, and they would rarely take care of it. As for houses, they knew that it was a transitional house, and they knew that it would soon be abandoned. Naturally, no one would do the best decoration for the house, and put all their savings on the house. Before this, for Luo Fan, the sixth level of the Tao Master's path was obviously a transitional house. Under such circumstances, it was only natural that he didn't care about it. However, it was clear that his understanding of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path was greatly limited. he discovered that the sixth level of the Tao Master's path contained even more mysteries that he had yet to discover. His indifference vanished in an instant. Although in the description of the true sage, the Great Tribulation was the key to the cultivation of the Tao Master's path, it was obvious that the creation of the true sage was not within the scope of the description. It seems that I have to pay more attention to them. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, incarnations rushed out of his heavens one after another, heading toward the broader and more abundant cultivation places of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. There were all kinds of strange groups of heaven and earth, groups of worlds, groups of space-time groups, strange dimensions, islands, mists, stars, continents, and even celestial devices and magic treasures. There were many experts of the six tribulations exploring and cultivating in those places. The goal of Luo Fan's incarnations was to find those places. However, the experts of the six tribulations did not care about the arrival of Luo Fan at all. None of the practitioners found Luo Fan's appearance strange. None of the experts of the six tribulations thought that Luo Fan's appearance was beyond their imagination. Obviously, this proved Luo Fan's previous speculation. In the cognition of those practitioners, the sixth level of the Tao Master's path was similar to what Luo Fan had known before. It was not that the appearance was similar, but the scale of the experts of the six tribulations was similar to what Luo Fan had known before. In their cognition, Luo Fan's existence, and even they had already felt his aura. Although, in Luo Fan's perception, before he recognized their existence, he couldn't feel their aura, and he couldn't discover their existence. However, this was one of the mysteries of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, the goal of Luo Fan's incarnations was the various cultivation places that he had just discovered and that had appeared in his cognition. There were quite a large number of these places. If he were to explore them one by one, it would take billions of years for him to go through one round. Therefore, he could only rely on his incarnations to explore. Fortunately, it was not difficult for him to divide his incarnations. Even though he had created billions and trillions of clones, it was still the same. Therefore, no matter how many areas there were, for him, it was just a situation that he could explore at the same time if he wanted to. Different areas had different mysteries. For the cultivators who stepped into them and the existences who grasped the essence of the cultivation place, there were also great differences in the benefit. Some of the benefits could not even be specifically described in word. One could only vaguely feel the existence of those benefits. Moreover, not all the benefits were beneficial to the heavens. Some even had some negative effects on the development of the heavens, but they were helpful to other existences. It could be said that after breaking the shackles of cognition, the sixth level of the Tao Master's path in Luo Fan's eyes had become a cultivation place that was many, many times more magnificent than before. Of course, at this time, what touched Luo Fan the most was not the appearance of the many cultivation places that he had not discovered before in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. Although these countless new cultivation places could allow him to make great progress in all aspects, it was still not enough. What really touched Luo Fan the most was some kind of subtle sublimation in his self-perception after breaking the cognitive distortion and cognitive shackles. At this moment, although it was still a short time, he could already clearly feel that he was very different from his previous self. Judging from the divine sense of perception alone, the divine sense of perception that he displayed now was at least twice as strong as before. In addition, his own world-view seemed to have some kind of inexplicable vitality, as if every point of view in it had a subtle self-derivation and self-proliferation flavor. It seemed that this worldview was beginning to grow on its own and achieve self-perfection. Of course, this flavor was extremely faint at this time, close to non-existent. But after all, there was already a little bit of such a flavor, compared to other progress. Such a change was obviously more important to him. If he were to use an ordinary person as an analogy, the other changes would be equivalent to giving him some kind of external object, such as the existence of food. But now, the changes that appeared in his worldview seemed to have given him some kind of ability. This was the difference between giving a man a fish and teaching a man to fish for a day. With this kind of subtle vitality, it was naturally impossible for him to let this worldview grow on its own and reach the true sage stage on its own. But at least, this subtle vitality could allow him to sense the direction of perfection of this worldview, and it could greatly improve the efficiency of perfection of his worldview. If this was calculated in terms of time, it might be the acceleration of time for hundreds of billions of years. Obviously, this was a change that was similar to breaking out of a cocoon and becoming a butterfly. For Luo Fan, the significance was beyond imagination. And this was only the benefit that he had obtained after slightly breaking free from the shackles of the Tao Venerable Path. This made him look forward to the benefits that this Tao Venerable Path could give him. Integrating opportunity into cognition, such a method is shocking no matter how many times I see it. At a certain moment, after carefully experiencing the changes in his worldview, Luo Fan could not help but sigh with emotion. At this moment, he had completely determined that this distortion of cognition was not some kind of shackles that a true divine used against ordinary cultivators. It was just some kind of opportunity that a true divine gave to ordinary cultivators. The higher one's cultivation realm, the clearer one's understanding of what a true divine could do. In the beginning, when he was in the innate zenith heaven realm, Luo Fan thought that true divine was actually a realm that could be reached after breaking through the innate zenith heaven realm. After that, in the sage-to-be realm, he thought that the true sage realm was above the sage-to-be realm. However, he didn't know that there was the false sage realm, the false sage realm, the hopeless realm, the supreme emperor realm, and now the calamity realm. The more he cultivated, the more Luo Fan understood the greatness of a true divine, and the more he understood how big the gap between him and a true divine was. Not to mention anything else, he would not be surprised to hear that there were many realms above the tribulation realm, if not for the few words left by many true divine telling him that the true divine was above the tribulation realm. If such an existence at the true divine realm really wanted to deal with an existence below the true divine, one could imagine how easy it would be. Luo Fan did not believe that if such an existence really wanted to shackle his cognition, he would be able to break through. In other words, if a true divine really did not allow him to know, he would never know. Everything that he did not know at first, but could find out later, must be things that the true divine had set up for him to know. For example, this kind of cognitive shackle was the same. If a true divine really wanted to completely distort his cognition, to completely shackle his cognition, he would never be able to break this kind of shackle at this time, and it would be impossible for him to restore his own cognition. Combined with the benefits that he had obtained after breaking the cognitive shackle, he could naturally know that this kind of cognitive shackle was actually a kind of cultivation opportunity that the true divine had set up for all the cultivators who had stepped into the Tao Master's path. From the first level of the Tao Master's path, it was a kind of cultivation opportunity that permeated their body and mind. The purpose of its existence was obviously to be broken by the cultivators, to be twisted back by the cultivators. As for the level of the Tao Master's path, this kind of cognition would be twisted back, and this kind of cognitive shackle would be broken. Obviously, it would depend on the cultivator's own ability and luck. I should be considered fast. This thought came to Luo Fan's mind, and he could not help but show a slight wry smile on his face. Based on his current level of the Tao Master's path, the time that he took to break this kind of cognitive shackle was indeed fast. However, based on his real cultivation realm, the speed at which he broke the cognitive shackle might not be very fast. After all, his real cultivation realm was the peak of the 7 tribulations, and he had even sensed that his 8th major tribulation was approaching the level of him. Clearly, He could no longer be held to the same standard as an ordinary sixth tribulation expert. Now, the standard that he used should obviously be the standard of those 7 tribulations experts, or even the standard of those 8 tribulations experts. But if he were to use this standard to calculate, it would be hard to say where he would rank. Chapter 31:44. When Luo Fan broke through the shackles of knowledge, it was unknown how many trillions of years had passed in the branches of those islands. Although Luo Fan's speed was quite fast, every step he took to break through the shackles of cognition was extremely short. However, no matter how short it was impossible to complete it in just a few breaths. The whole process of breaking through the shackles of cognition and the distortion of cognition took him several days. Clearly, a couple of days in the outside world was an unimaginably long time in comparison to the island branch. And this unimaginably long period of time was obviously enough for the island branches to undergo all kinds of incredible changes. Among them, the island branches were no longer the same as before. Compared to the time before Luo Fan broke through the shackles of cognition, the number of island branches had increased many times. It could be said that in terms of quantity, it had truly surpassed the number of world phantoms. And this was because the time in the outside world was too short. In just a few days, because of the peculiarity of the island branches, the number of sixth tribulation experts gathered was quite limited. If it were a little longer, it would not be unbelievable for the number of island branches to multiply several times. And in the process, the number of sixth tribulation experts who entered the island branches had exceeded the estimation of most sixth tribulation experts on the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road. However, because of the existence of the distortion of cognition, even if they watched the many sixth tribulation experts step into those island branches, they did not associate this with the number of sixth tribulation experts. They completely turned a blind eye to the abnormality in the number. However, this kind of turning a blind eye to any of the sixth tribulation experts did not interfere with their cultivation, did not interfere with any of the sixth tribulation experts, did not interfere with their cultivation, and did not interfere with any improvement. The mystery of this could only be explained by the means of a true saint. However, in the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road, Luo Fan was the only one who could understand this mystery. At least, as far as Luo Fan knew, he was the only one. He even suspected that the number of sixth tribulation experts he had noticed was only a portion of the total number of sixth tribulation experts who had stepped into his island branch. After all, he couldn't guarantee that his knowledge had been completely reversed and that the shackles of knowledge he had suffered had been completely broken. After a few days in the outside world, countless trillions of years of development had passed within the island branches, and the situation had clearly undergone tremendous changes. Now, the land of no family was no longer determined by its potential alone. Right now, the land of no family was truly a land of no family. Even the number of transcendents and sixth tribulation experts was terrifying. Among them, there were trillions of transcendents, and the number of sixth tribulation powerhouses was only 1 in 10 millionth of them. However, even if it was only 1 in 10 million, it was still a terrifying number of tens of billions. At this stage, it could be said that the number of tribulation experts in the countless island branches had reached an unimaginable level. It was even enough to transform quantity into qualitative change, and pose an unimaginable threat to Luo Fan, who was a peak 7th tribulation expert. Now Luo Fan's incarnation seemed to have transformed into the grand heavenly way above the land of no family, and its consciousness was similar to the land of no family. However, in reality, his control over this land of no family, over the countless islands and branches, had weakened by who knew how many times. Previously, he could directly change the inclinations of the laws of the countless island branches, and directly build the soil for the emergence of transcendence. For the current him, he could no longer do it. Now, the consciousness gathered by the countless transcendents, including ordinary transcendents and sixth tribulation experts, was the true consciousness that controlled the island branches. They were the true controllers of the various fundamental laws of the land of no family that existed in the countless island branches. Of course, the consciousness of all the transcendents was actually an abstract concept. It didn't truly exist. It was like the consciousness of a nation. Clearly, it was a consciousness that permeated the entire nation's subconscious. For those who had transcended the world, the collective consciousness they formed was similar to the abstract consciousness of a nation. Although this consciousness permeated every aspect of the land of no family, one could vaguely sense that this consciousness was controlling everything, arranging everything, and handling everything. However, even the sixth tribulation powerhouses would not be able to find such a consciousness. Because this consciousness was abstract, it couldn't be controlled by a single transcendent. It represented the interests of all the transcendent. It could even be said that it represented the interests of the land of no family among the countless island branches. It could be said that when this abstract consciousness formed, it meant that Luo Fan's incarnation could no longer control the countless island branches. He could no longer control the development of the land of no family. And it was also at this point that the development of the island branches began to slow down. In fact, the time it took for the island branches to branch out was already many times slower than at the beginning. In terms of time in the outside world, it would take a few breaths of time for the island branches to branch out again. But now this process had become over 100 breaths of time. And in terms of the time inside the island branches, this period of time was trillions of years. However, although the speed of development had slowed down, it was precisely because of this that the development of the island branches had become more stable. The entire process of development had become more complete. The loopholes that had appeared because of the hasty branching in the past were continuously reduced as the development slowed down. In fact, in the most recent branch, the branch process had almost reached perfection. As for the standards of the branches, the rules of the branches, how the newcomers could obtain benefits, how the early arrivals could obtain more benefits, what the benefits were, and so on and so forth, they had already become existences akin to fundamental rules. There was no need for anyone to specifically explain them. As long as one used their heart to experience the land of no family, they would naturally be able to understand all of these things. Moreover, the original man-made traces of these various settings could no longer be found. It felt as if these settings were the truth of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, as if they had been set up by the true saint when he first opened the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. It could be said that at this point, these island branches had already become an inseparable part of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. They had become the existence of all the other natural landscapes in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, such as the nebulas, the continents, the special dimensions, and even the strange groups of heaven and earth, world, and spacetime group. Of course, for the time being, this was just a trend. If Luo Fan's incarnation stopped supporting these island branches at this time, then the island branches would gradually collapse due to the loss of their foundation, and eventually disappear completely. Unless these island branches could continue to develop in this way for a period of time, and when the abstract consciousness of the person who had transcended truly stabilized and completely replaced the role of Luo Fan's incarnation, this hidden danger could be eliminated, and these island branches could completely get rid of their dependence on Luo Fan's incarnation. In other words, the longer Luo Fan's incarnation stayed in these island branches, it meant that the Tao Master's path would seize more island branches, and it meant that the time of losing these island branches was closer. It could be said that a powerful existence with a strong desire for control would rather destroy these island branches than watch these island branches be seized by the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. However, it was obvious that although Luo Fan had a strong desire for control, compared to controlling everything, what he wanted more was to improve himself and sublimate himself. From the time he first built an island to today's behemoth that penetrated billions of trillions of layers of nothingness, he had always had only one purpose: to improve himself and sublimate himself. Under such circumstances, if these island branches could help him achieve this goal, he would not care at all whether they belonged to him, the Tao Master's path, or were simply seized by other practitioners. As long as they could help him in his cultivation, as long as he could get more help and absorb more nutrients from these changes, it did not matter. Obviously, the changes of these island branches at this time met this condition. Therefore, even though he knew that these island branches were gradually getting out of his control and gradually becoming a natural landscape of the sixth level of the Tao Master's path, he did not think of a way to interrupt this process. He even took the initiative to create various conditions for the development of this process, and tried his best to help this change continue to advance. His performance might not have been noticed by those who had transcended in the first place. However, as time passed, as more and more traces were revealed, those who had transcended gradually began to understand this fundamental attitude of his. As they understood this, more and more of those who had transcended began to gradually relax. Although some of them did not understand Luo Fan's attitude and believed that if it were them, they would not do the same as Luo Fan, but most of them clearly understood him. Moreover, regardless of whether they understood or not, they were still happy to see Luo Fan's ulcers. After all, this kind of unrestrained ulcers was clearly more beneficial to them. After several days in the outside world, after countless trillions of years of development, the biggest change in the island branches was not the increase in the number of transcended experts. The biggest change was that the transcendents had finally found the way to a higher level that they had been pursuing tirelessly. Currently, in this lifeless land, apart from the transcendent transcendents who were originally at the sixth tribulation level, the other transcendent transcendents had already reached the third tribulation level. That's right, they had not only found a way to step into the second tribulation level, but they had also gone one step further and found a way to step into the third tribulation level. Currently, among the countless trillions of transcended experts, the number of third tribulation experts was already several times greater than the number of sixth tribulation experts. The number of second tribulation transcendents was tens of times greater than that of third tribulation transcendent. The number of tribulation experts was also several hundred times greater than the number of second tribulation experts. As for why they were able to break through, the most direct reason was naturally the formation of the abstract consciousness of the transcended experts. And the fundamental reason was that the sixth tribulation experts had thoroughly integrated into the circle of transcended experts. Because these transcendent transcendents at the level of sixth tribulation had completely integrated into the circle of transcendent transcendents, the abstract consciousness of transcendent transcendents had the opportunity to take shape. And the formation of this abstract consciousness had thoroughly integrated the subconscious of the sixth tribulation expert. In other words, it had integrated the cultivation path of the sixth tribulation experts, as well as all of their knowledge of cultivation. This fusion became the foundation of all transcendence, allowing them to follow the entire cultivation process of transcendence from the tribulation realm all the way to the sixth tribulation realm. In this way, as long as the transcendent beings carefully comprehend this abstract consciousness, they would naturally be able to find a way out of cultivation and find a way to advance further. Combined with the continuous expansion of the island branches and the increasing number of heavens and earths, they gradually found the true path and stepped into a higher realm. It could be said that the sixth tribulation experts had completely integrated into the foundation of their consciousness, allowing the transcended experts to take a step further in their consciousness. And the increase of the heavens and earths and the expansion of the island branches were the material foundation that allowed them to truly turn the possibility of their consciousness into reality. Chapter 3147. It was an organization that wasn't very secretive to begin with. Many of its members had set up their own organizations, and these organizations were hostile to each other, even wishing to wipe away all traces of each other. Naturally, such an organization only existed in name. But now, there wasn't much meaning to this organization that managed all the transcendent beings. In the past, this organization had great significance to the endless world. It ensured the sustainable development of any part of the world and did its best to prevent the destruction of the world due to the frequent appearance of the transcendent beings. But that was only in the past. Now, as the number of the transcendent beings increased and the overall consciousness of the transcendent beings took shape, this function of the organization gradually became meaningless. Back then, the organization had to use unimaginable authority to limit the frequency of the appearance of the transcendent beings, the size of the world they could carry, and so on because the world itself couldn't do anything about it. But now, as the situation changed, the overall consciousness of the transcendent beings had completely covered the entire world. Because of the implementation of this consciousness, the various rules of the organization had unknowingly become some kind of fundamental rule of the endless world. In other words, it wasn't that the transcendent beings couldn't violate these rules in the past, but because of the possible punishment that the organization could impose, they didn't dare to violate these rules. But now, it wasn't that they didn't dare to violate these rules, but that they couldn't. Although there seemed to be no restrictions and the world didn't seem much different from before, now, if the cultivators who wanted to transcend did not follow the rules of the organization, they would definitely not be able to transcend successfully. This was the result of the overall consciousness of the transcendent beings thoroughly penetrating the endless world. And with this implementation, it also meant that there was no longer any need for the organization to continue existing. But although there was no longer a need for it, this organization had a history of countless trillions of years and had long become a kind of common sense. It was like the existence of the endless world, like the existence of the transcendent beings, like the existence of cultivation, like the existence of all living beings. As such, even if its functions were no longer needed, before there were any major changes, the organization was still like an eternal and unmoving scenery, standing tall in the endless world, becoming a huge organization that ran through the endless world, or even stood above the endless world. Obviously, at this moment, a huge change occurred. Although it was just some different salvation organizations with different ideals, the result was even more tragic than the sudden appearance of some terrifying villains. If there were antagonists, one side would be righteous while the other side was evil. Their standpoints would be completely different. The side of justice would naturally be more resolute and have a greater sense of mission. They would be more willing to sacrifice themselves, and the possibility of winning in the end and ending the disaster would naturally be much greater. However, the current conflict was not between good and evil, but between justice and justice. They all believed that they were righteous, that their ideals were correct, and that they could save the endless world. They believed that the ideals of other organizations were wrong, that they were delaying the endless world, and that they were examples of people who did bad things with good intentions. Under such circumstances, their sense of mission, sense of responsibility, and being the only sober person in the world could be imagined. Therefore, any one of them would be extremely firm in their actions and might even sacrifice themselves without any hesitation. If it was just a single organization, they would be able to quickly gain the upper hand and end the disaster. However, if it was multiple organizations, or even every organization, it would be completely different. That would be a terrifying disaster for the endless world. Therefore, more and more chaos gradually appeared in the endless world. As time passed, the hatred that originally didn't exist gradually began to appear between different organizations. Those originally incomparably firm ideals of saving the world became firmer and more resplendent in the process, or they were gradually distorted and replaced by hatred. This caused the chaos, which had a chance to be controlled at the beginning, to become increasingly uncontrollable. This chaos affected the endless world, and became the true source of disaster for the endless world. Our efforts to save the endless world have ultimately become the start of a disaster. Could this be the so-called fate? On a certain day, tens of billions of years after the first Salvation Organization appeared, the leader of a certain Salvation Organization looked up at the sky and sighed. His voice spread to many worlds and reached the members of his organization. These Salvation Organizations were formed by people who had transcended the world, and they naturally had their own world formed by their transcendence. Therefore, even though it was only an organization, the members of the entire organization added together were enough to form a colossus. It could be said to be a grand group of worlds. Therefore, if they wanted to contact each other, they would usually rely on communication channels between different worlds. Of course, this didn't mean that this was the only way for them to contact each other. Don't forget, after becoming a transcendent, they would obtain the authority to monopolize a new island branch the next time they branched out. This authority would allow them to step into the void of the island branch or step into the endless world and begin to establish an endless world within the endless world. This endless world would once again branch out in the next round of island branches, creating even more islands that would be monopolized by the newly born transcendents. After a few rounds like this, it could be said that the relationship between the transcendents had become extremely complicated. It could be said that almost any transcendent already had the authority to traverse different islands and different worlds. After all, almost every world created by a supreme transcendent expert would be dispersed into countless islands after the islands were branched off one after another. Originally, before the transcendents appeared, the ownership of these worlds wouldn't allow the existences who established the worlds to traverse the endless island branches. This was because before that, the worlds between the different island branches didn't have a direct connection. Without a direct connection, once the worlds were distributed among the different island branches, it would be nearly impossible for them to sense each other. However, after the appearance of the Transcendent Realm experts, this situation had completely changed. The connection between the endless worlds that had been established by the emergence of transcendence would naturally connect the branches of different islands together. When the different islands were connected, they belonged to different islands, but they all belonged to the same transcendent being. Naturally, it would not be an obstacle for those transcendent beings to communicate with each other. Thus, from that moment on, the existences who could work for the island branches and establish the worlds for the island branches wouldn't be shackled by a single island branch. Instead, they could travel to the island branches they established at any time and any place. When the island branches finished growing and began the next round, it was clear that the division wasn't based on the number of worlds and their attribute. The birth of the island branches was completely based on the number of laborers. In other words, the division was based on the number of cultivators who established the world. In this way, it was almost impossible for there to be only one world in each new island branch. Every new island branch would have a different number of worlds, which would be given to the island branches at the same time. As a result, every time a new island branch appeared, it would be created by a different transcendent being. And this resulted in another result. Each new island branch would have a world created by a different transcendent. In the new island branch, there would be more than one pioneer who could cross the island branch and enter the other island branch. Instead, it was in relation to the number of the world creators in the new island branch. And as the owner of the new island branch, the transcendents who were given the authority to work for the expansion of the new island branch would have the authority to travel to any world within the island branch. This made it possible for the world creators to meet each other personally. The laborers of this island branch and the laborers of the other island branches would obviously have a connection in a certain world. If the number of the island branches were not many, the impact of such a personal meeting would be great, but it would still be limited. But once the number of the island branches increased to a certain extent, the impact would become immeasurable. You have authority on this island, but you don't have authority on the other island. On the other hand, I have authority on the other island, but I don't have authority on these two island branches. Just like that, as the number of the island branches increased, the complexity of the relationship would increase exponentially. In the end, the relationship between the transcendents would become unprecedentedly complicated. And this complicated relationship would allow any two transcendents to find a way to meet each other personally, as long as they were willing to look for it, and this was only for two transcendents. If the number of transcendents in the world increased to a sufficient number, the possibility of such a personal encounter would greatly increase. After all, transcendents didn't just rely on their own strength to step into a certain island branch. They could borrow the power of others and the authority of other transcendents to step into other island branches. Although it was a little troublesome, it wasn't impossible. And at this time, which salvation organization in this boundless world would have a small number of transcendents? Therefore, it wasn't difficult for any salvation organization to gather all its members together. Generally speaking, the headquarters of any salvation organization would be set up on an island branch that was closest to all the members of the organization. In other words, it would be in a world. For example, the world where the headquarters of this salvation organization was located was the world that had the closest connection with all the supreme transcendents in the organization. Any supreme transcendents in this organization only needed two people at most to find the path to enter that world. At this time, after hearing the words of the leader of the salvation organization, the world where the members of the organization were located was silent. The topic of fate was a very heavy one, even for these transcendent beings. This was especially true when they felt that this kind of fate really existed and that it was incomparably difficult for them to struggle within it. After a long time, a member of the organization said, "Perhaps it is fate, but we don't have a choice. To save the world, we have to destroy the other organizations. Only our organization can save the boundless world." At this time, how could there be any salvation organization that couldn't see the source of the calamity? But so what if they could see it clearly? Their ideals of saving the world would only become firmer when they saw the source, but it wouldn't collapse because they saw the source clearly. At the very least, that was the case for the salvation organizations that still existed in the boundless world. Those organizations that couldn't see the source of the calamity and those that couldn't strengthen their ideals had completely collapsed and disappeared in history over the past tens of billions of years. Therefore, at this time, none of the members of this organization were shaken by the fact that the source of the calamity was them. All of them firmly believed that they were the main characters that could save the boundless world from the calamity and that all other salvation organizations had gone astray. They would only make the boundless world more chaotic and closer to destruction. Even if they were to save the world, they had to be completely destroyed. That's right, they must be destroyed. The leader of the organization, a transcendent who had transcended 3 tribulations, said resolutely. In fact, it was not merely to unify their thoughts that they were saying these things here and now in this manner. Their true goal was to encourage them before the battle. This was because they were about to start an earth-shattering war. It was a terrifying war that could destroy hundreds of worlds and erase a world salvation organization along with these worlds. The disaster that this war would cause might be the greatest disaster in the boundless world in the past tens of billions of years. The destruction and death it would cause would be unprecedentedly terrifying. Chapter 31:48. Soon, one of the countless island branches suddenly trembled. The source of this tremble was none other than a certain layer of the island branch. Or rather, it was the destruction of a certain layer of the world. This was the first step of the Salvation Organization's operation. It was clear that the Salvation Organization had prepared for a long time to complete this step. Once it was activated, it produced an unimaginable effect, starting with the complete destruction of a part of the world. This part of the world was none other than the logistics of the hostile organization that they wanted to destroy. Any organization would have its own division of labor. Even for organizations that had members who had transcended the world, it was the same. For example, logistics, headquarters, distribution, internal affairs, law enforcers, and so on also existed in these organizations. However, compared to ordinary organizations in the secular world, their functions were more mysterious. For example, the Internal Affairs Department provided and managed all sorts of information, templates, race seeds, management plans, and so on that were incomprehensible to the people of the secular world. Many other departments had similar functions and were also fundamentally different from the departments in the secular world. However, its role in the organization and its importance to the organization was similar to the importance of those departments in ordinary secular organizations. The importance of the logistics department to an organization was self-evident. It could be said that without the logistics department, the organization would have no foundation. Without the logistics department, the organization would exist in name only. Therefore, attacking with the logistics department was clearly the best choice to deal with an organization. In a situation where there was no way to directly attack the enemy's headquarters, at this time, the importance of this part of the world to the hostile Salvation Organization was similar to the importance of the logistics department to an organization. It was precisely because of this that this part of the world was completely destroyed in the first wave of attack. At this moment, countless gazes shot out from the many island branches and gathered on the ruins of the logistics department. "How dare you!" Furious roars appeared out of nowhere and instantly enveloped the ruins. At this moment, the endless world began to tremble slightly. Some kind of indescribable fluctuation reverberated among the many island branches, as if the countless island branches were readjusting themselves and forming a perfect system. Although the endless heavens and earth seemed to have endless heavens and earth, every single heavens and earth seemed incomparably small compared to the endless heavens and earth. But in reality, every world was an extremely important part of the endless world. That was because every world was an indispensable layer of a certain island's branch. And every island branch was an indispensable part of the entire island branch system. Only when all the islands and branches were gathered together would they form the complete foundation of the endless world. In this way, the destruction of any part of the world would cause unrest in the branch of the island it was in. This kind of turbulence would definitely affect the entire island branch system, and then affect the endless world that was the foundation of this island branch system. It was precisely because of this that there were endless ripples reverberating in the endless world. At this moment, in the face of such a change, Luo Fan's gaze was involuntarily focused on the island branch where this world was located. The destruction of a world that was an important part of the island was something that had never happened since he first constructed the complete island. For a long time, the number of worlds had only increased, and they had never been destroyed. Even the greatest disasters, even the greatest tribulations of the world, in the end, would only cause the world's interior to shatter into countless pieces. The world as a whole was still complete. Of course, this was not because the world would not collapse after it was born. Instead, it was because Luo Fan's will had always enveloped the endless island branches, drawing the final bottom line for the endless world's disasters and tribulations. It was precisely because of the existence of this bottom line that no matter what kind of tribulations those worlds encountered, no matter how the cultivators fought inside and outside the world, they would not truly destroy any of the world. But clearly, this bottom line no longer existed. Luo Fan's authority over the countless island branches had already been suppressed by the collective consciousness of the many transcendent. Although he could still fuse with the vast exchange between the countless island branches and the void ocean, and could still obtain the nutrients he needed from this exchange at all times. However, his control over this boundless world had been greatly reduced. This reduction made it impossible for him to draw the bottom line for the endless world, which was why this world was finally completely destroyed in this battle that was not actually the most intense since the island branches had appeared. The Salvation Organization that had launched the attack was also slightly stunned by this change. Although everything had been planned and carried out by them, they still found it hard to believe when they saw that their plan had caused this world to completely collapse and achieved the first world-destroying achievement since the birth of the Endless World. As expected, the Endless World is no longer the same as before. The soil for the disasters and tribulations has already been prepared. The leader of the Salvation Organization sighed, and became even more determined to destroy the opposing Salvation Organization. He paid no attention to the questions from the other transcendents. He immediately followed his own plan and started to pursue and attack the enemy organization. They actually destroyed the world. At this moment, Luo Fan watched all of this and felt a strong urge to make a move. Although his authority in the countless island branches had been squeezed and even replaced, he was still a peak 7th tribulation expert no matter what. If he really wanted to make a move, none of the transcendents in the world would be able to truly resist him. Moreover, although his authority had been suppressed and replaced, he was still the creator of the countless island branches. The roots of these island branches still originated from him. No matter what, he definitely still had a bit of authority over the endless world. This bit of authority might not allow him to completely control the countless island branches and the endless world like before. However, it was still not a problem for him to display extraordinary strength in this place, with these various conditions. If he wanted to make a move, the Salvation Organization that had destroyed the world would definitely not be able to hold out for long. In less than a few minutes, he would definitely be able to get rid of them completely. However, after some thought, he still suppressed his intention to make a move. Firstly, the current situation of the island branches was much better than he had imagined. Although the world in the island branches had lost a layer due to the sudden destruction, it looked like a chain had suddenly broken in the middle. This should have caused the chain to completely collapse or turn into two incomplete chains. However, in reality, there were all sorts of indescribable nutrients constantly being transmitted over from the endless world. They continuously flowed into the island branches and stabilized the other worlds of the island branches. They even started to gradually rebuild the passage between the two worlds that had been destroyed. In other words, the upper and lower worlds of the destroyed logistics world had bypassed the logistics world layer and directly established a relationship between the upper and lower worlds. If one were to look at it from the perspective of a chain, it would mean that the broken link of the two chains that should have been broken was directly discarded, and the remaining complete chain was reconnected, turning into a complete chain that was one link shorter than the previous one. The instant the connection was established, the ripples that reverberated between the heavens and earth swiftly calmed down. Not long after, it was as if nothing had happened. The serious consequences that Luo Fan had expected did not appear. The reason for this was obviously because of the close communication between the endless worlds. Because of the close communication between the endless worlds, every island branches and every world had indescribable passages between them. These passages truly formed the endless worlds into one, as if it had turned into a boundless ocean. Under such circumstances, when a part of the ocean suddenly sank and some seawater suddenly disappeared out of thin air, the other parts of the ocean would naturally be filled with endless seawater to support the sunken and missing parts. In this case, this kind of sinking and this kind of loss would naturally disappear very quickly. At this time, for the endless worlds, the destroyed world was equivalent to a part of the ocean suddenly disappearing out of thin air. In this way, the other endless worlds would naturally begin to gather nutrients to fill these gaps and repair the holes here. Of course, this was only a rather crude analogy, and the specific situation was naturally much more subtle and complicated than this. The second point was that although this was the first time such a situation had happened, However, since it had already happened, it meant that from now on, this kind of situation would happen more and more often. This time, Luo Fan had indeed punished them, which could indeed make other cultivators who wanted to do similar things have some scruples. However, when their impulse to destroy broke through this scruple, the destruction that should be caused would eventually still happen. This happened again, and in the end, the situation would probably not be much different from before. Unless Luo Fan could be vigilant at all times and nip all the seeds of destruction in the bud, the final outcome would ultimately be the same. Obviously, Luo Fan did not build these island branches and countless worlds to find trouble for himself. He had constructed all of this in preparation for his own cultivation. Under such circumstances, how could he waste his time to protect this boundless world? Since taking action would not have much effect on the outcome of the matter, and would instead bring great trouble to himself, making it difficult for him to cultivate, of course, he did not bother to take action. Perhaps this is the reason why this place is recognized by the Tao Master's path? When he stopped planning to take action, such a thought appeared in his mind out of thin air. How could a normal, endless world be indestructible? Even the various natural landscapes of the Tao Master's path, all kinds of worlds, all kinds of spacetime, could be destroyed and destroyed. Even the Tao Master's path was like this. How could the island branches and the worlds he had built really be completely indestructible? It could be said that the fact that these island branches could not be completely destroyed and had a final bottom line had already made these island branches fundamentally different from nature. Perhaps the reason why these island branches were not accepted by the Tao Master's path before, and the second tribulation experts cultivated in them could not directly transcend to the second level of the Tao Master's path. This unnaturalness was also one of the reasons. At this time, Luo Fan suddenly felt that he had some subtle new understanding of cultivation. Faintly, his cultivation realm seemed to have lost some of its charm. Under Luo Fan's indifferent gaze, the destruction of the Salvation Organization was not smooth sailing. As mentioned before, the source of the disaster in the endless world was caused by the different salvation concepts of different salvation organizations. Under such circumstances, any established organization would naturally have a sense of mission to shoulder the life and death of the endless world. Under such a sense of mission, in the face of the organization that directly destroyed the world and the foundation of the endless world, it was self-evident what they would think. In just a moment, this salvation organization was regarded as the real source of the disaster by a large number of other salvation organizations. This was simply equivalent to directly putting a target in front of other organizations. In an instant, all kinds of attacks began to be launched from various organizations, aimed at the salvation organization that destroyed the logistics of a certain side. How dare you destroy the world? It seems that you are the source of the disaster. Let's get rid of you first. This was an attack declaration publicly spread by a salvation organization. This declaration was the voice of many other salvation organizations, and it was also the righteous reason for their attack. Chapter 3149. Although the Salvation Organization that brazenly destroyed the world had expected that their actions would cause great changes, they did not expect the changes to be so intense. For a time, they used all sorts of means to barely withstand the first wave of attacks from the Salvation Organizations. However, the losses far exceeded their imagination. As a result of such losses, their performance in the second, third, and fourth waves of attacks became worse. In the end, the entire Salvation Organization collapsed after 10 waves of attacks, and the leader of the organization was killed. The remaining members received different punishments according to their positions in the organization. The worst punishment was death, and the weakest punishment was sealed. The entire process only took a few hundred years. Compared to this, the Salvation Organization that this Salvation Organization was targeting did not gain any benefits and suffered heavy losses as well. Of course, compared to their original fate of being completely destroyed, they were only damaged now, which could be considered to have gained a lot of benefit. Amidst the waves of attacks, the conflicts between the Salvation organizations became more and more irreconcilable. After all, there were benefits to splitting up an organization. It was impossible for these benefits to be distributed evenly. Naturally, some organizations would gain more benefits, while others would gain less. This was the source of the conflict. Hence, the cooperation of the many organizations did not ease the atmosphere in the endless world. On the contrary, it made the atmosphere in the endless world even tenser. The siege of the Salvation organizations had a great impact on the environment. Although they still had some scruples in the process and did not completely break through the bottom line of not destroying the world, they did not cause complete destruction to any part of the world. However, in the process they still caused great damage. Tens of millions of worlds had completely lost their lives because of this war. Apart from the completeness of the world itself, everything else was no different from the destruction of the world. The vitality within, the yuan qi within, the energy within, the laws within, and so on, had all been completely annihilated. If they wanted to restore the vitality of the world, apart from needing a long time, they would also need the help of many external forces. Fortunately, the connection between the endless heavens and earth was very tight. As long as the endless heavens and earth existed as a whole, no matter how thoroughly the endless heavens and earth were destroyed, they could absorb endless nutrients from the other endless heavens and earth to recover bit by bit through this connection. Therefore, even though they looked extremely miserable at this moment, it was only temporary. This siege was like the opening of a Pandora's box, and the intensity of the battles in the endless world suddenly increased by 1,000 times. The battles between the various organizations became more and more intense. In the midst of battle, the world would lose its vitality and be on the verge of destruction. Even the complete destruction of the world, causing a layer of the world on a branch of an island to be completely destroyed, was a common occurrence. The endless world seemed to be shrouded by an indescribable shadow, and the entire world sank into an indescribable pressure and terror. However, this situation did not reduce the number of organizations in the endless world. On the contrary, this kind of oppression, this kind of terror gave birth to even more organizations. What was the reason for the birth of so many Salvation organizations in the past? It was because those who had transcended could sense that the endless heavens and earth had changed, and they had a premonition that an inconceivable disaster would appear in the endless heavens and earth. That was just a premonition, but it had already given birth to so many organizations and brought so many problems. Now that the disaster had already happened, and the endless heavens and earth was shrouded in oppression and terror, how could those who had transcended turn a blind eye to it? Naturally, they could only actively band together to deal with this terror and disaster, and could no longer rely on luck to deal with everything like before. And the increase in the number of organizations caused the scale of the conflicts in the endless heavens and earth to become even larger. This further intensified the oppression and terror in the endless heavens and earth. In a conflict between two people, even if it developed to its peak, the biggest possibility was that one or both of them would fall. This kind of intensity was naturally quite intense for both sides. However, compared to the conflict between organizations, this kind of conflict between people was obviously nothing. No matter what, an organization could not have only one person, right? Under normal circumstances, the number of members in an organization should be plural. No matter how small an organization was, a dozen or so members were obviously very few. For such a conflict, even if it was the smallest organization, it would still be a matter of a dozen or so members. In such a conflict, if one or both organizations were to be destroyed at the same time, it would still require the destruction of a dozen or so members, and this was only based on the smallest organization. Under normal circumstances, How could an organization be called an organization only have a dozen or so people? Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people, this was the norm for a normal organization. If there was a conflict between such organizations, how could the scale of the conflict be comparable to a conflict between humans? At this time, in the endless heavens and earth, this kind of situation was even more vivid and vivid. No matter how strong the conflict between the transcended experts was, it was still between two different worlds. And no matter how weak the conflict between the organizations formed by the transcended experts was, it still happened between hundreds or even thousands of worlds. Under such circumstances, the appearance of so many organizations in the endless heavens and earth had a great impact on the chaos in the endless heavens and earth was self-evident. For a time, the intensity of the chaos in the endless heavens and earth skyrocketed, and the pressure and terror that enveloped the endless heavens and earth became more and more intense. This is a tribulation. Luo Fan saw all of this, and he could not help but sigh inwardly. In the beginning, he did not think of this, but as many coincidences appeared and the situation developed in a straight line, no matter how slow he was, he finally realized this point. The world had a tribulation of the world. The chaos layer had a tribulation of the world. The heaven and earth group had a tribulation of the world. The world group had a tribulation of the world. It could be said that as long as an existence was truly recognized by the state of chaos, there would definitely be a tribulation. Ever since Luo Fan had an understanding of the state of chaos and cultivation, all signs pointed to this point. In fact, during his seventh tribulation, he had even come into contact with the chaos layer tribulation that simulated the state of chaos and targeted the transportation network layer that he had built. Although it was only a simulation of the Great Tribulation, it was not a simulation without a foundation. There was definitely a basis for it. In other words, if there was no real chaos layer tribulation in the state of chaos, there would not be such a simulated chaos layer tribulation in the simulated state of chaos. If even the chaos layer was like this, other existences would naturally not be an exception. Therefore, it could not be more normal for endless tribulation to appear in the endless heavens and earth. Of course, there was a precondition for this, and that was for the existence of the state of chaos to be accepted. The endless heavens and earth, or rather, the many branches of the islands, did not directly come into contact with the state of chaos, nor did it receive any recognition from the state of chaos. However, it had clearly been accepted and recognized by the Tao Master's path. And what was the Tao Master's path? The Tao Master's path was built by an eternal, indestructible, omniscient Tao Master. The things built by such an existence had obviously reached the peak in a certain aspect. In other words, the Tao Master's path, to a certain extent, already possessed the characteristics of the state of chaos. In this way, being accepted and recognized by the Tao Master's path, to a certain extent, was already recognized by the state of chaos. This was the reason why the endless world would not cause the endless tribulation of heaven and earth. But this time, after he had truly opened the path to the third level of the road to Tao Master, this was the fundamental reason for the arrival of this kind of tribulation. After seeing this clearly, Luo Fan knew that he could only rely on the cultivators in the endless heavens and earth to deal with this tribulation. If he took action, he might be able to completely resolve this tribulation. However, there would also be a serious consequence. The Tao Master's path would be recognized by the endless heavens and earth, and it would be withdrawn. In that case, it would seem that he had regained control of the endless heavens and earth, as well as the many branches of the islands. However, the potential of the endless heavens and earth would be completely destroyed. Once this happened, even if he completely regained control of the endless heavens and earth, the benefits that he could obtain from it would be greatly reduced. And this was only the effect on him. If he really intervened and the Tao Master's path was withdrawn, it would also have a very serious impact on the many creatures and transcendents in the endless heavens and earth. It would greatly reduce their potential, and it would also greatly reduce the nutrients that they could obtain from the endless heavens and earth. Once that happened, it would only be a matter of time before the endless heavens and earth completely perished. After all, without nutrients and potential, how could those creatures stay in the endless heavens and earth? Naturally, they would do everything possible to transcend and leave the endless heavens and earth, even if the endless heavens and earth was their home, and even if they were reluctant to leave the endless heavens and earth. But if there was no future here and they could not go further, their feelings for this home would eventually be worn away over the endless years. And once this feeling was worn away, they would naturally not waste any more time staying here. As for how to transcend and leave, there was even less to say. If the Tao Master's path no longer acknowledged and accepted the endless heavens and earth, then it would be impossible for the cultivators here to directly transcend and enter the third level of the Tao Master's path. This seemed to directly cut off their path of transcendence and leaving the endless heavens and earth. But don't forget what the endless heavens and earth's cultivators' path of transcendence was like in the beginning. At that time, they could directly transcend and enter the first level of the Tao Master's path. At that time, the endless heavens and earth had not yet been acknowledged and accepted by the Tao Master's path. Since it had been accepted back then the endless heavens and earth would naturally return to how it was back then if the Tao Master's path withdrew its recognition. In other words, the first level of the Tao Master's path would be open to them again. Therefore, the cultivators here did not need to worry about not being able to find a way out. In the end, the only ones who would suffer would be the endless heavens and earth. When he thought of this, Luo Fan's last bit of intention to take action was completely dispelled. In the end, they still have to rely on themselves. I hope they can react quickly. Luo Fan sighed inwardly and just quietly watched the situation develop in the endless heavens and earth. Compared to Luo Fan, who could directly see the source of the disasters in the endless heavens and earth, those who had transcended in the endless heavens and earth obviously did not have such an ability. Even those experts who had undergone the 6 tribulations could not really see the source of this disaster. After all, their vision had not risen to the level of Luo Fan. Even the disciples of the Tao Masters could only look at one side of the heavens and earth. They knew that there would be tribulations in the heavens and earth, that there would be tribulations for all living beings, and that there would be tribulations for cultivation. But they did not know that there would also be tribulations when so many heavens and earth converge together. Even the experts who had undergone the 6 tribulations were like this, let alone those who had transcended who were not experts who had undergone the 6 tribulations. They could not even imagine the tribulations of the endless heavens and earth. At this time, they only regarded the organizations that had caused the conflicts as the source of the disaster and tried their best to resolve the conflict. But their efforts had instead become a new source of conflict, causing the conflicts between the endless heavens and earth to become more and more intense and large-scale. In this way, it almost formed an endless cycle, causing the situation in the endless heavens and earth to become worse and worse. In the eyes of those who had transcended, this was an indescribable taste of fate. Moreover, it was an increasingly strong taste of fate. It was as if all their actions and efforts were under the control of fate and were gradually pushing the endless heavens and earth towards an ending that they did not want to see. Chapter 3150. The appearance of the endless tribulation of the heavens and earth was something that no living being had ever encountered before. However, as long as it existed, there would naturally be traces left behind. Even if no one had encountered such a tribulation before, as it continued to develop and more traces of it were left behind in the endless world, the existence of such a tribulation was gradually noticed by the supreme transcendence in the endless world. Not everything required experience to be discovered. Not everything needed to be told before one could know. If that was the case, then how did the first existence to understand certain things understand those things? It was the same for the endless tribulation of the heavens and earth. although none of the living beings in this boundless world had ever seen such a tribulation, and none of them knew about it from any inheritance. However, through summarizing the various traces left behind by this tribulation and combining it with their own knowledge and guesses, they'd finally confirmed that this wasn't an ordinary calamity but a tribulation hundreds of thousands of years after the tribulation erupted. It was a tribulation that targeted every corner of the world, every cultivator, and even every living being. Naturally, the supreme transcendents who first proposed this idea were doubted by many. After all, this idea was too subversive. However, as more and more traces of the tribulation appeared in the endless world, the truth of this idea was verified time and time again. In the end, after this idea appeared for hundreds of years, it was finally acknowledged by all the supreme transcendents. Now that the endless world was in the midst of an unprecedented tribulation, this gradually became common knowledge in the endless world. Knowing this, although the salvation organizations wanted to restrain themselves and stop attacking each other, they did not dare to do so. However, it was a pity that while it was easy to start an attack, it was clearly not so easy to end the conflict and end the attack between the two sides. How could the conflict and enmity that had accumulated over such a long period of time be severed by a simple reason that it was not good for the endless world to continue? Most of the salvation organizations could calm down and choose the best choice for themselves and the endless world. However, as long as a part of the salvation organization was not calm and rational enough, the conflict would never stop. Could all the salvation organizations in the endless world be calm and rational enough to deal with the enmity? How was this possible? Transcendent cultivators were cultivators who could not bear to part with the things they cared about. Such cultivators were clearly more sentimental to begin with. The more emotional they were, the more they couldn't let go of their hatred. Even if the reason they established the organization was to save the world and save the endless world, the situation would obviously become many times more complicated from the moment they established the organization. Perhaps before the establishment of the organization, they would be able to look at everything calmly and rationally, but after the establishment of the organization, the members of the organization would naturally establish a closer relationship with each other, creating a stronger bond. This kind of restraint would affect their rational judgment, making it difficult for them to act from the standpoint of the endless world like before the establishment of the organization. For example, before the organization was established, if a supreme being died, they would at most feel that it was a pity, but they wouldn't feel obligated to avenge him. If his death was beneficial to the peace of the endless heaven and earth, he might even secretly praise his death in his heart. However, if this supreme being became a comrade of the organization, the situation would be completely different. It was impossible for them to remain indifferent to the death of their comrade. In their hearts, they would definitely believe that they had the obligation to avenge their comrade. Even if the death of their comrade was beneficial to the peace of the endless heaven and earth, they would still find it difficult to let go of this enmity. Thus, it was clear that after these organizations were established, things like rationality wouldn't be able to dominate the judgment of the supreme beings who established the organization. Thus, among the numerous organizations, only a small portion of the organizations were truly rational enough to let go of all enmities and would rather keep the peace, making sacrifices for the sake of the endless heaven and earth. Even more organizations knew that their actions would cause the endless heaven and earth's tribulation, but they couldn't suppress the hatred in their hearts and continued to attack the enemy organization that had brought great damage to their organization. At most, they would have some plans in their hearts, deciding to cultivate their hearts and minds after the enemy organization was destroyed and contribute to the endless heaven and earth's tribulation. Unfortunately, this was clearly wishful thinking on their part, not to mention the fact that they couldn't easily destroy the enemy organization. Even if they destroyed the enemy organization, would the organizations and supreme beings who were related to the enemy organization be willing to keep the peace and completely let go of their enmity? Obviously, the possibility of that was very small. Once they did that, it wouldn't be up to them whether they could escape or not. Thus, even though the existence of the endless heaven and earth's tribulation had become common knowledge, the battles between the endless heaven and earth didn't decrease much. In fact, due to the fact that the salvation organizations all wanted to end the battle quickly, the intensity of the battle had increased by a lot. The scene was even more chaotic than before they knew about the existence of the endless heaven and earth's tribulation. Luo Fan watched for a while, then sighed and shifted his attention away. He once again guarded his body and merged with the endless heaven and earth, or rather, the grand exchange between the countless islands and the ocean of nothingness outside. The endless heaven and earth was currently in the midst of the endless heaven and earth's tribulation, and it seemed to be many times more chaotic than before, even faintly showing signs of overturning. However, all these changes didn't disrupt the grand exchange between the endless heaven and the ocean of nothingness around it. On the contrary, it seemed that the endless heaven and earth's tribulation was a direct effect of the state of chaos, making the exchange smoother than usual. There were more mysterious existences circulating at every moment than usual. This was obviously of great benefit to Luo Fan. It allowed him to gain more than before in the process of integrating into this kind of communication. For Luo Fan, such a harvest could barely be regarded as a pleasant surprise. In any case, it was impossible for him to interfere with the endless heaven and earth's tribulation, so there was no meaning in focusing his attention on the endless heaven and earth's tribulation. As Luo Fan focused his attention on the grand exchange, time passed bit by bit. In the blink of an eye, tens of millions of years had passed in the endless heaven and earth. After tens of millions of years of development, the endless heaven and earth's tribulation still hadn't faded. On the contrary, it seemed to have become more and more powerful. Back then, the effect of the endless heaven and earth's tribulation was only manifested in the battles between the various organizations. Now, after tens of millions of years, almost every part of the world had fallen into a strange endless heaven and earth's tribulation. Of course, there were still conflicts and fights between those salvation organizations. Not only did they not fade completely, but they were even more intense than before. As for the conflicts and enmity between the organizations, they had reached an irreconcilable state. Although they called themselves the organizations of the world, they didn't even put half of their energy into saving the world and helping the worlds resist the various endless heaven and earth's strange endless heaven and earth's tribulations. At most, they only put 30% of their energy into saving the worlds. The lesser amount was only for show, and they didn't even put 10% of their energy into saving the world. Most of their energy was spent on attacking each other. After tens of millions of years of fighting, the accumulated enmity between the organizations was so deep that it could not be washed away even with all the water in the world. The enmity itself was enough to distort the minds of the members of the organizations. Not to mention the fact that the endless tribulations of the heavens and earth were subtly guiding and influencing them from behind the scenes, making the enmity even harder to wash away, making the conflict between them even harder to eliminate, and making it even harder to reconcile. That was why the current situation was like this. Why has it developed to this stage? It's already been tens of millions of years. Why hasn't the endless heaven and earth's tribulation passed? In a certain world, two familiar transcendents were conversing. These two transcendents were the ones who had persuaded each other to give up on the idea of transcending and leaving the endless heaven and earth. The one who spoke was one of them. "Do you regret staying?" the other asked with a sigh. When they had decided to stay, the endless heaven and earth had been completely different. Back then, although the endless heaven and earth had not been without tribulations, the endless heaven and earth's tribulations had only stopped in one part of the world. The overall situation had been calm and peaceful. That endless heaven and earth had obviously made people happy. But now, the boundless heavens and the earth were completely different. Presently, there were battles everywhere, chaos everywhere and tribulations everywhere. There was slaughter, death, and destruction everywhere at all times. Just listening to such a place was enough to make people feel irritated, let alone being in it. It could be said that the endless heaven and earth before them and the endless heaven and earth they had wanted to see were two extremes. Under such circumstances, if one of them suspected the other would regret it. This was not even a real suspicion, but a simple judgment. No, I don't regret it. On the contrary, I'm glad that I chose to stay. The first supreme transcendent sighed. Although there was a tinge of pain in his expression, there was more joy in it. Obviously, just as he had said, he was glad that he had not chosen to transcend and leave the endless heaven and earth. Instead, he had chosen to stay here. Why? The other person asked curiously. To be honest, he also regretted not transcending and leaving the endless heaven and earth. Over the years, there had been many times when he had the urge to transcend and leave. However, due to various reasons, he had suppressed these urges in the end. Because if I transcend and leave, everything I care about might have already been destroyed in this tribulation. That transcendent expert let out a long sigh, and an indescribable sorrow appeared on his face. His words caused the expression of the other transcendent to change slightly. Then, he smiled bitterly. Indeed, it seems that I can't let go of my world. The reason why he had suppressed the urge to transcend time and time again was because of all sorts of strange reasons. It was as if he had been hindered by trivial matters time and time again, making it difficult for him to let go of everything and transcend. Previously, he had not seriously thought about it. He had only felt that there were too many things and that there were too many changes, making him unable to truly feel at ease. However, now that the other party had explained it to him, he understood that the reason why he could not transcend and leave the endless heaven and earth was not because of those trivial matters. There was only one reason that had truly made him give up on the idea of transcending. It was the foundation of his transcendence. Because he could not let go of his world, because he was worried that his world and his people would suffer misfortune after he left, he had suppressed the urge to transcend time and time again. He had chosen to stay in the endless heaven and earth, choosing to continue protecting his world. Even though he felt annoyed at the endless heaven and earth that had fallen into chaos, even though the endless heaven and earth's cultivators disappointed him, he did not change his mind. In fact, this kind of mentality could be inferred to the many transcendents who had remained in the endless heaven and earth. Among them, there were very few who truly felt that the situation in the endless heaven and earth satisfied their own interests and what they desired to see. Most of the transcendents were like these two and felt that the situation in the endless heaven and earth disappointed them. But even so, there were still a majority of them that remained in this endless world. The reason for this was clearly similar to those two existences that had transcended. It was because they couldn't bear to part with their own world and their own people. Love for oneself, love for one's home, love for one's country. This was the mentality of a normal person, and it was the same for cultivators. Even if a cultivator became a transcendent, there would not be any fundamental change. The most fundamental reason for the transcendents to be reluctant to leave the endless heaven and earth was their world and their people. Chapter 31:51. Their love for their own world and their reluctance to part with their own people was the fundamental reason why so many transcendents had given up on transcending and left the endless world. Therefore, although the endless world was in a chaotic and oppressive state, making it difficult for them to have a good impression of it, most of them still stayed. Of course, although they had stayed in the endless world for the sake of their own world and their own people, it did not mean that they were resigned to the situation in the endless world. In fact, during the long endless world's tribulations, the transcendents were still working hard to find a way to help the endless world's tribulations. Of course, they were well aware of the results of the Salvation Organization's actions. Therefore, the efforts of the remaining transcendents to overcome the endless tribulations of the world were mostly only at the planning stage. Very few of them actually took action. As the endless world's tribulations continued to develop, they gradually came to understand some of the characteristics of the endless world's tribulations. They understood that if they did not grasp the key to the endless world's tribulations, all their efforts would only be used by the endless world's tribulations. In the end, they would become the driving force for the endless world's tribulations. That was why they made such a decision. The longer the endless world's tribulations lasted, the more power they displayed, and the easier it would be to see through their roots. It was clear that the endless world's tribulations had lasted for tens of millions of years. By any standard, the endless world's tribulations could not be considered short. After such a long time, even if the endless world's tribulations were extremely obscure and profound, even if it was the first time the transcendents had come into contact with the endless world's tribulations, they were still able to see through the traces left behind by the endless world's tribulations and see the essence of the endless world's tribulations. Although the endless world's tribulations were still oppressive, filled with destruction, and filled with slaughter, the situation in some heavens and earths was gradually changing. The endless world's tribulations that had yet to subside gradually calmed down. Due to some inexplicable mechanism, those heavens and earths received some sort of indescribable blessing, causing the endless world's tribulations to improve. The appearance of this situation was like a subtle, clear stream flowing into the endless world. Although it was not enough to completely free the endless world from the endless world's tribulations, it gave the despairing endless world a glimmer of hope. A rare glimmer of hope. "You've found a way?" When that happened, a stream of inquiries and information surged from all over the world to the rulers who had helped their own world through the tribulations. Or to say the transcendent. They were all people who had transcended the world, who didn't know each other. No matter how slow-witted a transcendent being was, after being trapped in this endless tribulation for so many years, he would definitely have a deep understanding of the situation in this endless world. For them, the world's tribulations were endless world's tribulations. Water had a different attitude. Although they wanted to save the world, they were using a more restrained method to find a more appropriate solution. Even if they couldn't explain it clearly, they had a rough idea long ago. Endless worlds to worlds up, and for to be, and with God for the world. And worlds, so, for the world. To be. For with. For the world's transcendents who were worried that the endless world would be destroyed in the tribulations and wanted to help the endless world, how could they let this chance go? Even if the world's transcendents who had succeeded in world's tribulations were quite different from what they had imagined, even if the logic behind those transcendents differed greatly from their own, it was their greatest hope in this desperate moment. Of course, there were naturally transcendents who held on to their own ideals and continued to explore. But in the end, they were only a minority of the group. The consequences of the conflicts between the different ideals of the Salvation organizations were the best evidence. The Salvation organization's performance over the past tens of millions of years was the best evidence. With such evidence, the world's transcendents who were still rational and had not lost their rationality because of the conflicts would naturally be more restrained. They could search for solutions by themselves, but to truly save the endless world was not something they could do alone. That was why the world's transcendents, who had successfully helped their world escape the tribulations, had no intention of keeping the methods they had discovered a secret. They had directly integrated the methods they had discovered into the communication between the endless world, and through this communication, the information had been transmitted to every part of the endless world. Whether it was the Salvation organizations that had become a part of the endless world's tribulations or the world's transcendents who had restrained themselves and only focused on finding solutions, the world's transcendents who had not participated in the conflict all received this information at the same time. As this information was publicized to all the world's transcendents, the situation in the endless world's tribulations changed slightly. Although it was still oppressive, the world's tribulations that had erupted endlessly in every part of the endless world's tribulations gradually calmed down. In just a few short years, the world's tribulations that had yet to calm down had been reduced by almost 90%. Due to the efforts of almost all the world's transcendents, most of the worlds had barely escaped the tribulations. In fact, because they had escaped the tribulations, they had even received some sort of subtle feedback from an indescribable existence in the outside world, which had greatly benefited those worlds. Every aspect had more or less improved. Looks like the first wave has passed. Somewhere, a world's transcendent let out a long breath, and his expression relaxed a little. However, he had only relaxed a little. There was still a long way to go before he could completely relax. After all, the tribulations had only affected about 90% of the world's tribulations. There were still 10% of the world's tribulations that were still affected due to various reasons. Just the conflicts between the world's tribulations that had become irreconcilable due to the endless world's tribulations had not eased at all compared to before. Under such circumstances, although a large number of worlds had escaped the tribulation's influence and seemed to have obtained freedom and safety, in reality, this was only one aspect of resolving the tribulations. The true focus of the tribulations was not much different from before. How could the world's transcendents, who clearly knew the truth, truly relax? How could the world's transcendents, who clearly knew the truth, truly relax? I have to think of a way. This is already the best chance. If I miss it, I don't know when I'll get another chance like this. The world's transcendents thought to himself with an indescribable urgency. This was the best chance to resolve the irreconcilable conflicts between the world's tribulations. Because in order to save their own world, in order to save their own people, those who had transcended had forcefully broken free from the control of the endless tribulations of the world, pouring almost all of their energy into the huge project of helping their own world. Although they had not completely broken free from the endless world's tribulations' influence, they had at least regained their rationality and were now able to communicate. As the crisis of their worlds passed, the influence of their worlds and their people on their minds naturally began to dissipate. If this continued, it wouldn't be long before their rationality was once again controlled by the endless world's tribulations. They would once again fall into their previous state and find it difficult to communicate. Therefore, to truly resolve the conflict between them, they could only take advantage of the time when they could still communicate. If they missed this time, they could only wait for the next time when they could communicate. Obviously, the appearance of such a moment was hard to control. Perhaps it would happen again and again in the future, but it was also possible that this would be the last time. If he missed this chance, he would never be able to encounter such a moment and the same opportunity again. I believe that all of you know the current situation. If we don't take action now, we will all lose this home. The world's transcendence transmitted his thoughts to the other worlds through the subtle communication between the endless world. As his thoughts spread, one transcendent expert after another who was still calm echoed his sentiments, spreading the same or similar words throughout the boundless world. Through this transmission of information, it gathered into an indescribable tide that began to wash over the endless worlds like a real tide. At the same time, it also washed over the minds of the transcendents who were gradually falling back into the endless world's tribulations' control. The nature of one person saying something and countless people saying the same thing at the same time were completely different. When someone spoke alone, no matter how reasonable his words were, not many people would truly listen to him unless his words had been proven to be correct time and time again. Moreover, this person's words could be guaranteed to be heard by others. And if countless people said the same thing at the same time, then, even if the sentence was very stupid, as long as anyone calmly thought about it, they would be able to tell that the sentence was nonsense, that it was taken for granted, that it was a grave mistake, and that it was unbelievably persuasive. This kind of thing had happened too many times in the mortal world. Many people had made decisions that they couldn't understand in hindsight. At the transcendence level, this situation was no exception. Although it was more difficult for transcendents to achieve the same effect compared to ordinary people, it was only a difference in method. There wasn't much difference in essence. At this time, the words of the transcendents had clearly formed a similar effect. Finally, it gathered into an indescribable persuasive force, causing the transcendents who were gradually immersed in the hatred between the world's tribulations to calm down. Of course, this calmness was still rather limited. They couldn't let go of the hatred between the world's tribulations just because of these words. They couldn't forget the harm that the world's tribulations had done to their loved ones and the endless worlds. If they didn't take the next step, it wouldn't be long before they would once again fall into that indescribable state. They would once again be controlled by the endless world's tribulations and become one of the forces pushing the endless worlds towards the abyss of destruction. Your fight can continue, but it can't continue in the endless worlds. We can create a world for you to fight to your heart's content. One of the transcendents hurriedly said. His words instantly received the approval of many transcendent. Of course, the first batch to respond to this suggestion wouldn't be the transcendents of the world's salvation organizations. The first batch to respond would obviously be the transcendents who had always maintained their calm and secretly searched for a way to save the world. Although they each had their own thoughts and arrangements for those salvation organizations, it was clear that due to the precedence of those salvation organizations, they also knew that if there was a conflict between these different methods, they would clearly follow in their footstep. It would only bring chaos to the endless world. Thus, they already had a tacit understanding at this time. They were rushing to answer to decide on a way to save the world. In other words, as long as the first method was reasonable, they would agree with it no matter what methods they had or what more exquisite methods they had. This wasn't a mutual agreement, but it was a tacit understanding. At this time, constructing a world to become the battlefield for the world's salvation organizations was clearly a method to benefit from this tacit understanding. Just like what had been said before, when a phrase was repeated by countless people, it would be unimaginably persuasive. It was the same for such a suggestion at this time. The fact that countless transcendents said the same thing at the same time made the persuasiveness of this method unimaginable. Chapter 31:52. For those who had transcended, opening up a world was an ordinary matter. After all, even the weakest transcendent could nurture a small world that they had brought with them into a complete world. As for those who had transcended, they were like experts who had undergone 6 tribulations, working hard for their island branches for a long time. In other words, they had opened up an unknown number of worlds. For such existences, opening up a world was naturally not difficult at all. Thus, the difficulty of the many transcendent experts working together to open up a world was to unify everyone's goal and not how to accomplish it. And at this time, with the many transcendent experts working together to open up a world to serve as the battlefield for the salvation organizations, the process of unifying their goal was naturally completed. Of course, this did not mean that what they were about to do next would come naturally. After all, the world they were working together to open up wasn't the kind that could exist in the void and become a new layer of the island branches. Instead, it had to be a world that could endure the struggles of the salvation organizations. Naturally, the construction of such a world was many times more difficult than an ordinary one. Thus, after the many transcendent experts had come to a consensus, many streams of information quickly flowed back and forth between the many worlds. The first thing to be determined was the location of the battlefield. This was also a point that was extremely likely to cause a conflict. However, it was clear that the current situation was extremely different from before. At the very least, the transcendent expert who had opened up the battlefield clearly had a certain level of authority in this regard. After all, he was the one who had proposed this, so he naturally had more considerations about the location of the battlefield. This was something that the other transcendent experts agreed with. Hence, this point that was enough to trigger a conflict passed peacefully. And the final location of the battlefield was in the boundless world, in the region with the highest concentration of the transcendent experts. The distribution of the transcendent experts was uneven. After all, there were no specific rules that dictated where the transcendent experts would appear or how they would be distributed. Under such circumstances, the distribution of the transcendent experts was naturally random. And random naturally meant that there was an imbalance. And if there was an imbalance, there would be places where the transcendent experts were concentrated and places where they were sparse. Of course, the difference between density and sparseness wasn't huge. However, no matter how big it was, there was still a difference. Since there was a difference, it could become a standard. This was the place with the densest concentration of transcending experts in the world. Originally, there was nothing special about this place. In the boundless world, it was just a seemingly ordinary place. However, once it was determined to be the location of the battlefield, it had unknowingly become the center of the boundless world. From the perspective of the island branch, there was nothing special about this location. The void ocean layer where the island branch was located was also an ordinary void ocean layer in the endless void ocean layer. It could be said that the reason it had become the place where the battlefield had been established was entirely due to luck. After confirming the location of the battlefield, the next step was to design the world. This step was also the most important step in the entire process. As for the rest, no matter how good the location of the heaven and earth was, no matter how well the process of establishing the heaven and earth was done, as long as the design of this step was not perfect, everything would be in vain. And this step was also the crux of the debate. Many transcending experts had their own ideas, and each of them believed that their ideas were the most perfect. However, these different ideas would naturally conflict, and vaguely, they would become another source of conflict. Fortunately, many transcending experts knew that they were already in the midst of the boundless world's tribulation. Their thoughts, their wills, and their wills were all likely to be affected by the endless world's tribulation. Therefore, at this time, when faced with this possible source of conflict, they immediately reacted to the risks involved. Thus, they used the fastest speed possible to nip this conflict in the bud. This can't go on. There needs to be someone to unify everyone's opinions. A transcending expert directly transmitted this information to the boundless world, into the hearts of all transcending experts. Although deep in their hearts, they weren't very satisfied with this. In order to prevent the conflict from erupting again and to prevent themselves from being controlled by the endless world's tribulation, they could only make this choice. However, they could only choose such a choice. Although they were not satisfied with it, they could still reluctantly accept it. As for the existence that had unified everyone's opinions, it was obvious that it was the Transcendent who had suggested this method and confirmed the location of the battlefield. This transcending expert was originally a very ordinary transcending expert who could be considered to have blended into the crowd. However, this time, because of this suggestion, he had unknowingly obtained this kind of authority under the influence of the circumstances. From then on, he stood out from the crowd and was no longer the same as the other transcending experts. It could be said that this could be considered a hero created by the times. At this time, a heavy pressure pressed down on the heart of this transcending expert, making him feel that he had an incomparably great responsibility. However, he didn't dare to directly take out his ideas. As the one who had proposed this idea, he naturally had his own ideas on how to open up the battlefield. However, his ideas weren't perfect either. This was something that was inevitable. If he could come up with a perfect plan, how could he have been blended into the crowd? He would have stood out from all sorts of other opportunities. Although he didn't dare to say that he was above everyone else, he definitely wouldn't be as ordinary as before. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't be willing to give up on such an imperfect plan. After all, no matter how imperfect it was still a design that he had painstakingly conceived. To him, such a design was like his own child. Even if their own children were not smart, who would despise their own children because of this? Who wouldn't give up on their child when they saw an opportunity? Under such circumstances, he would definitely do his best to argue and refute the other transcending expert. He would do his best to make his design the final one. However, it was clear that the current situation was different. Right now, the others had completely given up on their authority to decide and handed the final decision over to him. This was simply akin to handing over the life and death of the boundless world to him. That kind of pressure was unspeakable. It was as if an ordinary person suddenly had to decide the life and death of an entire country. Under such circumstances, how bold would an existence have to be to dare to hand over such a crucial task to his child, just because his child was qualified to bear such a heavy responsibility? No matter how selfish an existence was, before making such a decision, they would have to carefully weigh whether it was worth it or not, right? This was true for ordinary people, and it wasn't much different for these transcending experts. The only difference was that these transcending experts were more rational, more intelligent, and more decisive than ordinary people. Thus, at this time, the transcendent who had been pushed forward to make the final decision could only endure the pain and put aside his own designs, working hard to integrate the billions of designs that the other transcendent transcendents had put forward. When he truly put his heart and soul into those designs, this transcending expert would truly understand how extraordinary the other transcending experts were. Different transcending experts had different worldviews. Of course, they all walked the righteous path and didn't truly organize their unique worldviews. They only organized some specific concepts that belonged to their own worldviews. This different worldview caused their designs of the world to be different. Moreover, it was unavoidable that there were also different concepts that belonged to them. These concepts were about heaven and earth, all things, all living beings, the universe, the primal chaos, and everything else. If such a concept appeared alone, it would only make the transcending expert feel offended and want to refute it. However, when there were hundreds of millions of people with such opinions, the situation was obviously completely different. It was as if there were mirrors placed around him from different angles, and each mirror reflected his own appearance from different angles. Because of this naturally made the transcendent's understanding of himself clearer and even more profound. Clearly, this was not a small opportunity for this transcendent being. His understanding of himself became clearer and more profound, which was enough for him to improve his realm. Of course, this wasn't an instantaneous change. It wasn't something that could immediately improve his cultivation realm just by experiencing and studying it. Instead, he had to wait until he had enough time to digest these gains and turn them into his own concept. Only then would he be able to turn them into the true driving force for his realm improvement. At this time, the greatest benefit for this transcendent was that he gradually understood what kind of design he should come up with to serve as the design for the battlefield. Although he seemed to have put his own world aside, the final design he came up with was still based on his own design of the battlefield. After all, this design was the amalgamation of all his inspirations and was the product that best suited his worldview. Although he knew that it wasn't perfect and that it would easily collapse halfway if he used it directly, it was still a design derived from his own worldview. Such a design determined the criteria for his choice of other designs. In the end, a large part of the design of the battlefield that he integrated was naturally chosen from his own design. Of course, after all, it was a design plan that had integrated countless other battlefields. This final design was countless times more perfect than the original design he had come up with. Perhaps because of his own worldview, this design wasn't the best combination of all the other designs, but it was already above the standard and was enough to be used. As a transcending expert, the speed of his thinking was self-evident. Although it was a massive project to integrate hundreds of millions of designs, only a few breaths had passed by the time the final result was out. In such a short time, the salvation organizations could clearly endure it. The situation of the endless world wouldn't change because of this. This is my integrated design. I hope that everyone will act as soon as possible. The transcending expert transmitted his design, along with these words, to the hearts of all the transcending experts in the endless world. Naturally, it was impossible for all the supreme transcendents to be satisfied with this design. In fact, it could even be said that no supreme transcendents were truly satisfied with it. However, none of the supreme transcendents felt that this was unacceptable. In other words, none of them felt that this design was perfect, but everyone felt that it was passable. Clearly, at this time, it was enough for everyone to feel that it was a passable design. As a result, boundless energy began to erupt from the endless heaven and earth, and through various indescribable paths and channels, it headed towards the location of the battlefield that they had chosen. Every transcendent was an existence that could single-handedly create a world. At this time, it was unknown how many billions of transcendent beings had sent their power according to the blueprint. Although the sum of their power wasn't as terrifying as billions of worlds, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that there were billions of worlds. A huge figure appeared at the location of the battlefield. Its hands were raised high, and there was a huge phantom above them. This phantom was incomparably mysterious and complex. It felt like an incomparably vast world. At this moment, the power that had gathered from the endless world was like rivers flowing into the sea. It directly surged into the illusory world and continued to merge with it. It became a part of the illusory world and gradually filled up the illusory world. As more and more power poured in, the phantom became more and more solid. It felt like it was gradually turning illusory into reality. Chapter 3154. This battlefield was still in its embryonic form, just a silhouette. In order to become a complete world, it needed to grow, evolve, balance, and adjust itself. It could be said that this battlefield was just a framework. What kind of world it would eventually become, and what kind of appearance it would have would depend on how it would evolve. Perhaps its final appearance would be similar to the original heaven and earth design, or perhaps it would be completely different from the original heaven and earth design. None of this was certain. At this time, the members of the Salvation Organization had entered the battlefield. Their intentions were clear. They clearly intended to participate in the evolution, self-balance, self-adjustment, and self-growth process of the world. At the very least, he had to allow himself to be completely accepted by the battlefield and become a part of the battlefield. The best-case scenario was for the battlefield to evolve according to their ideas and create some elements that were most suitable for them. None of these supreme transcendents were stupid. If one of them had such an idea, the others would naturally follow suit. At this time, they rushed into the battlefield and began to exert their own means to the best of their ability. They used their own will, their own power, their own perception, their own mystiques, their own might, and even everything else to influence and change everything around them. If it was only one supreme transcendent, then this plan might have a chance of success. Even if they couldn't completely change the world according to their ideas, they would still be able to slightly influence it and give it some characteristics that belonged to them. However, it was clear that it wasn't just one supreme transcendent who had entered the battlefield. Right now, there were at least hundreds of millions of transcendents who had stepped into the battlefield. With so many supreme transcendents, each of them was using the same method to influence the evolving battlefield. In the end, the evolution of the battlefield became incomparably chaotic. It was as if every supreme transcendent expert had changed the evolution process of the battlefield, but none of them had truly changed the battlefield into what they wanted. In the end, the appearance of the battlefield seemed to contain the traces of all the transcendence in this world, but there was no trace of them at all. Everything seemed specious and confusing. In the end, when the battlefield took shape, it was no longer similar to the design shown in the blueprint. All similarities had changed due to the influence of the numerous transcendents, becoming a completely different and distorted form than before. Apart from this, it was also the most crucial reason why this battlefield world was called a battlefield world. That was the degree of stability of this world. The degree of stability. As a battlefield that could accommodate all the transcendent experts of the world, its endurance was naturally of the utmost importance. If one's endurance was not strong enough, just a little bit of power would cause the world to collapse. Everyone would have to leave this world. In that case, how could this world become a battlefield? What use did it have? The most obvious manifestation of the endurance of the battlefield was the stability of the world. What was stable was space, rules, laws, the great Tao, and so on. What was stable were space-time, dimensions, planes, karma, fate, and so on. This kind of stability had to be at least at the level of being able to withstand the battle of the three tribulations in order to barely meet the requirement. And in the best case, it had to be at the level of being able to withstand the battle of the six tribulations. After all, there were many six tribulations among the Supreme Transcendent. Compared to the Supreme Transcendents below the three tribulations, their thoughts were more rational, and their battles were naturally limited to the six tribulations. But in the end, it was still a battle, and they still needed to enter the battlefield. However, it was a pity that it was not easy to create a world that could withstand the battle between sixth tribulation powerhouses. Even if millions of supreme transcendents worked together, it would still be impossible. As a result, in the end, the world they created was only able to withstand a battle between cultivators who had undergone the fourth tribulation. From a certain point of view, this was already an incredible achievement. From the endurance of the battlefield, it was enough to show how extraordinary the supreme transcendents were. In fact, the stability of this battlefield was already much stronger than the other greater heavens and realms. Of course, this did not mean that the quality of the battlefield was better than that of the larger world. In fact, it did not mean that the battlefield's endurance was higher than that of the larger worlds. The reason for this judgment was not complicated, because the strength of the larger world was all round, and it was a balanced, perfect strength. Although the degree of stability were the most important indicators of endurance, it was clear that these two were not the only indicators. There were countless factors related to the endurance of the world. For example, the degree of perfection of the laws, the tolerance of the great Tao, the variety of the world's yuan qi, and so on were all closely related to the endurance of the world. Although the stability of the large world couldn't compare to the battlefield world, it was countless times stronger than the battlefield world in terms of other factors that were related to its endurance. So, in terms of endurance, it was many times stronger than the battlefield. Perhaps even a battle between true sages could be withstood by the vast world, of course, because of the different factors. The endurance of the battlefield was completely different from the battlefield. In the battlefield, the destructive force within its endurance range was unable to shake the spacetime, laws, the great Tao, and many other aspects of the world. If it couldn't even shake the spacetime, then it was naturally impossible to destroy everything. In comparison, the larger world was completely different. Because its endurance wasn't based on the degree of stability, the spacetime, laws, and the like weren't difficult to affect in the larger world. It could even be said that so long as the destructive force slightly reached a certain standard, it would be sufficient to destroy spacetime. However, because of the influence of many other factors, even if these aspects were destroyed, the nature of the larger world wouldn't be affected much. Even if spacetime was destroyed, it would only be equivalent to a small wound on the skin of the larger world. It would either recover completely in a short period of time, or it would completely treat the destroyed scene as a new natural landscape. Compared to the two, the battlefield was like an oyster with a shell growing on it. On the other hand, the larger world was like an incomparably strong martial artist. The shell of an oyster was obviously very hard, and it was even 100 times harder than the skin of a martial artist. However, the gap between an oyster and a martial artist was as huge as the distance between heaven and earth. A martial artist was powerful in all aspects. Even if their skin wasn't as hard as the shell of an oyster, their nature was still countless times stronger than that of an oyster. If they really had the ability, they would naturally open up a larger world to serve as the perfect battlefield for those salvation organizations. However, even a true saint couldn't accomplish something like opening up a larger world in one go. They had to first open up a perfect world, and then let the perfect world go through 9 tribulations before they could truly obtain a larger world. Among these supreme transcendents, the strongest was only a 6th tribulation powerhouse. They were still millions and millions of miles away from the true saint realm, so how could they do this? From a certain perspective, they could think of increasing the stability of the world to the extreme, to the point where it could withstand the battle of the supreme transcendent. This was already pushing their abilities to the limit. At this time, as the battlefield took shape, the supreme transcendents began to use all sorts of methods to investigate this world in order to find the arrangements they had made in the previous world. It was obvious that their search was destined to be disappointing. The arrangements of the supreme transcendents interfered with each other, and the final result was that none of their arrangements could be preserved. However, even though they couldn't find his various arrangements, the supreme transcendents weren't too disappointed because of this. Although their own arrangements weren't preserved, the other supreme transcendents' arrangements weren't preserved either. In this case, the situation wasn't perfect, but it wasn't too bad either. In fact, this had already reached the bottom line of the supreme transcendent. If they could really preserve their own arrangements, and if they could really rely on these arrangements to defeat many enemies and hostile organizations, they would instead suspect that there was something wrong with it. On the contrary, although the current situation was somewhat disappointing, it showed that their judgment of the development of the situation was correct. Their understanding of the battlefield wasn't too far off. From this point of view, the situation could be considered quite perfect. The stability of space and time is sufficient. The supreme transcendents began to use their own methods to test the endurance of the world. After a series of tests, they felt rather complicated. Originally, as tribulation experts, regardless of whether they were tribulation experts, 2nd or 3rd tribulation experts, the world was extremely fragile to them. As long as they wanted to, not to mention breaking through spacetime, it wouldn't be difficult for them to destroy the world. But now, in this world, they discovered that even if they used their full strength, they could at most create some cracks in spacetime. Not to mention completely destroying the spacetime continuum. Even if he wanted to create a bigger crack, he wouldn't be able to do it. How could these supreme transcendents, who were used to destroying the world, not feel the slightest bit disappointed by this disparity in effect? However, their rationality told them that only such a spacetime could withstand the battle between them. If they didn't have this kind of strength, the spacetime that was like a normal world would be meaningless for them to fight. Because that kind of time and space was a test of their ability to control their power, and not a test of their true strength. In such a normal world, they had to be extremely careful and cautious with their attack. If they used a little more strength, their strength would be wasted due to the collapse of spacetime. And this level of strength couldn't even shake their opponents, let alone injure them. And if they couldn't even injure their opponents, what was the point of fighting? Was it just a game? In comparison, the current situation on the battlefield was clearly different. In this battlefield, even if they used their full strength, they couldn't truly destroy the spacetime of this world. Because of this, they could naturally use their full strength in this world, and they could naturally injure each other. This kind of battle could naturally continue, of course, Even though they had confirmed that this battlefield was strong enough to withstand their battle, these supreme transcendents did not immediately start fighting. It wasn't because they had worked together before that their conflict had eased, but because they knew that in this strange world, if they didn't familiarize themselves with it, the extent of their strength would be relatively limited. And it was hard to say how much of a threat they could bring to their opponents with their limited strength. It was even to the extent that attacking under the circumstances that one wasn't familiar with the effects of one's own techniques on the battlefield might cause one to reveal flaws that one didn't have in the first place and allow one to reveal flaws that one shouldn't have. If that was the case, they might be digging their own graves if they weren't careful. All the supreme transcendents were clear about this. Under such circumstances, how could they not familiarize themselves with this world? How could they hastily fight with their enemies? The real battle would only begin hundreds of years after this battlefield was formed. Chapter 31:55. There was no need to describe the scale of the battle. Even though it was difficult for the transcendent experts in this battlefield to destroy spacetime, laws, and other things as easily as they could in a normal world, most of them were tribulation eminences. Which of these existences didn't have the means to create a world and call themselves spacetime? Which of them didn't open up thousands of spacetime and create billions of worlds? When they fought like this, the world changed colors, the sun and moon lost their light, the universe sank, and all things withered. During this process, the entire battlefield began to tremble in a strange manner. The aura of destruction poured out madly, and it even stirred up the fog that enveloped the battlefield, which had been reinforced with countless layers of runes of the great Tao. It made all the transcendents in this endless world inexplicably nervous. After hundreds of years of familiarizing themselves with the battlefield, the transcendent experts in this battlefield were already extremely familiar with it. They also knew how their means could be used in this battlefield. As a result, none of them would make a mistake in their battle because they couldn't predict the effects of their means. Every transcendent expert's means could perfectly achieve the effects they had expected. The entire battlefield, which originally had no other characteristics apart from being stable and stable, had been blessed with billions of strange characteristics of every description. During this process, the originally empty world gave birth to even more strange creatures. Under the control of the transcendent experts, these creatures carried out all sorts of activities, causing the entire battlefield to be filled with vitality. Of course, even if it was filled with vitality, it wasn't of much use to this battlefield. This was because these creatures were extremely chaotic due to the different effects of the transcendent expert. Be it their species or their behavior, it was the same. This transcendent being had created them, but the next transcendent being had started twisting them in another direction, and the next transcendent being had twisted them in another direction. Just like that, as their numbers increased, the living beings naturally became extremely chaotic. Such chaotic creatures appeared in this world. At one moment, they were contributing to the sublimation of the world, but in the next moment, they wished for the entire world to wither. Under such circumstances, what use was their existence to the world? At most, it would only make the battlefield less desolate. The number of salvation organizations that had entered the battlefield was quite large. There were at least tens of thousands of them. Each of these salvation organizations was quite extraordinary. After all, they had already experienced the first round of eliminations in the endless world. Those organizations with insufficient strength had already been eliminated in the first round of eliminations. The number of transcendents in each of these salvation organizations was counted in the hundreds of millions. Although every organization had their own leader, and nominally, it was the leader who controlled those organizations, to decide all the adjustments and actions of the organization. However, in reality, when an organization grew to a certain extent, it would give birth to an overall will. This will was formless and incorporeal, and it was even more abstract. If one wanted to find it, no matter who it was, it would be difficult to find this will. However, as long as one was in that organization, one would naturally be able to feel the influence of that will. Even the leader of the organization could not defy this will. He had to act according to the requirements of this will. He had to speak and do things according to the requirements of this will. If he disobeyed this will, the first person that the organization would deal with would be him. Therefore, although the leaders of these salvation organizations had different personalities, some were tolerant, some were narrow-minded, some were vicious, some were kind, some were merciful, some were vicious, and so on and so forth, it was possible to find all kinds of personalities. However, the actions of these salvation organizations were very similar. Everyone's choice under the corresponding situation was also extremely clear. At this time, for the salvation organizations, destroying other organizations was their greatest need. With such a need, the battles in the battlefield became more and more intense. In the beginning, the salvation organizations had some misgivings between each other. They were worried that their battles would cause the battlefield to collapse, and then the repercussions of their battles would spread beyond the battlefield and affect other worlds. However, as time passed and the battles between them became more intense, they unknowingly let go of their misgivings. They no longer cared about the possible consequences of their battles and vividly displayed their method. Under such circumstances, the trembling of the entire battlefield grew stronger and stronger, and its influence on the mist outside grew stronger and stronger. From time to time, boundless runes of the great Tao would appear in the fog around the battlefield, doing their best to resist the terrifying impacts that leaked out from the battlefield and were enough to severely damage a region of the world. Facing such a situation, how could the transcendents outside dare to be careless? The transcendents, who had been confined to the battlefield and had relaxed a little, immediately threw away all hope in their hearts and poured all their attention into the blessing of the mist. As they poured all their attention into it, the frequency at which the runes appeared in the fog increased by several times. It had been several hundred years since the battlefield had been born. During these hundreds of years, all the transcendents in the world were constantly adding bricks and tiles to the mist. Almost every few breaths, the runes of the Grand Tao in the mist would increase by one layer. After several hundred years, the number of great Tao runes in the fog was clearly in the trillions. With such a scale, if one was a little more ambitious, they would definitely be able to sleep peacefully. Therefore, it was only natural that those who had transcended the world would feel relaxed. However, it was clear that even though there were trillions of great Tao runes, it was still far from enough for the battle that was taking place on the battlefield. Even with so many layers of the great Tao runes, the mist was still unable to endure the shock waves that seeped out from the battlefield. Frequently, several layers or even dozens of layers of the great Tao runes would be broken apart with a single eruption. Such a shock wave would appear every few breaths. In this way, if they didn't work hard to strengthen the fog at all times, it wouldn't take long for the fog to be completely broken through. Even if there were trillions of great Tao runes in the fog, it was still the same. They really seemed to be throwing caution to the wind, one of the transcendents said helplessly. Shouldn't we have known this a long time ago? They have long since been controlled by the boundless tribulation of the world and are no longer able to act on their own. Another transcendent sighed with a hint of pity on his face. How sad! They have cultivated for so long, but in the end, they are controlled by the tribulations. Another transcendent lamented. The profundities of the tribulations aren't something we can imagine. Right now, we can only do our best to protect the endless world and hope that this tribulation will pass as soon as possible. Every transcendent being knew that they were a part of this endless tribulation of the heavens and earth. It was impossible for them to stay out of it. Thus, at this time, the connection between the various transcendents of the world was much closer than usual by who knows how many times. After all, who knew if the others would suddenly be controlled by the tribulations and attack them instead? Naturally, they needed to communicate with others as much as possible to eliminate any misunderstandings that might arise from communication problems. With the precedent of the previous salvation organizations, they already knew that such misunderstandings were actually the focus of the endless tribulations. That was why it was so common for several transcendent beings to gather in one place like this to appear in the boundless world. And this tighter connection allowed the transcendents to understand each other more and more deeply. Their understanding of their respective cultivation paths, and cultivation directions also deepened. In this way, the path to higher realms that they were brewing became clearer and clearer. Cultivation was something that happened all the time. Even if these transcendents were constantly helping the fog around the battlefield with the great Tao runes, it didn't mean that they would give up on their own cultivation during this period of time. Although the great Tao runes were troublesome at first and required a lot of their energy, it was still a repetitive action. As time passed and the number of times the great Tao runes increased, it naturally became an almost instinctive action for them. Once something was treated as an instinct, it would no longer take up too much of one's energy. In this way, they would naturally have more and more energy to do other things. For example, cultivation or exploring the path to take a step further. In comparison, exploring the path to take a step further was what they desired more. During the tribulations, cultivators felt the most about the importance of strength. The more severe the tribulations, the more they felt the importance of strength. This was especially true for the transcendent. Amidst the endless heavenly tribulations, they could clearly feel how weak they were. They could feel that they needed to improve further. And for the many transcendents in the endless world, what truly limited them wasn't talent, intelligence, or opportunities. Instead, it was the path. The vast majority of transcendent transcendents were limited to the third tribulation realm because the path to the fourth tribulation realm had yet to be explored. Under such circumstances, for the vast majority of transcendents, finding the path to take a step further was clearly more important than cultivating step by step. That was why they placed the focus of their cultivation in this area. With the focus on this aspect of cultivation, the communication between the many transcendents became much closer than before. The conflicting paths of cultivation, ideologies, and knowledge caused the path that was brewing to emerge from the darkness at a speed faster than they could have imagined. Finally, at a certain moment, a third tribulation expert found this path, allowing him to brazenly break through his limits and use this path to reach the fourth tribulation. All the transcendents felt both joy and shock. How could it be so fast? According to the previous experiences, it would take at least trillions of years to find this path. A transcendent exclaimed in disbelief. Finding a new path wasn't a process that could be measured, and luck played a huge role in it. However, in reality, no matter what, the time and scale needed to explore a new path was something that could be roughly estimated. It was like tossing a coin. Whether the coin came out heads or tails, no one could know before the result was out. But if the process was repeated countless times, then the number of heads and tails would be very clear. The number of times the two would be roughly the same. Similarly, finding a path to take a step further would be the same. No existence could know when a new path would be found and how long it would take to become a fourth tribulation expert. But no matter what, it should at least be similar to the previous search process, right? In other words, the amount of time and energy needed to find a way to become a fourth tribulation powerhouse should be about the same as the amount of time and energy needed to find a way to become a third tribulation powerhouse. Perhaps it would take a little less time, or perhaps it would take a lot more time. But no matter what, it wouldn't be much less than that. This was common sense. This was the normal law of development. According to the estimation of the Supreme Transcendence, there were still trillions of years between the appearance of the path to the third tribulation and the appearance of the path to the third tribulation. It could barely be said that the time interval was the same as the time interval between the appearance of the path to the second tribulation and the appearance of the path to the third tribulation. Chapter 31:56. Almost every transcendent being in the world had sensed this fact. Perhaps not many of them were able to sort out this common sense and estimate the exact time when the path to the next step would appear. However, they still had a very clear sense of when the path of advancement was normal and when such a path of advancement was abnormal. It was like tossing a coin. Before the result appeared, no one could know whether the coin would come up heads or tails. When the number of times the coin was tossed was low, even if it came up heads or tails more often than half the number, most people wouldn't find it strange. However, when the number of times the coin was repeated increased to a certain extent, everyone would know that the person who tossed the coin was cheating. Clearly, no one knew how many times the coin would come up heads or tails after tossing it so many times, and no one understood the rules. However, their instincts would let them know what kind of probability was normal, and what kind of probability was abnormal. It was the same for the transcendent experts at this time. Not many of them could measure the rules of when the path to the next step would appear, but their instincts told them that a time that was too different from the rules was abnormal. But at this time, the time that allowed a third tribulation expert to advance to the fourth tribulation expert was not a normal time. It was a time that was much faster than normal. Suddenly, a transcendent expert said thoughtfully, "Perhaps this is the benefit of the tribulation." His words seemed to have lifted the fog in front of the eyes of all the transcendents. They instantly came to a realization, and all their doubts disappeared in an instant. All the doubts that remained in their hearts were instantly answered. That should be it. No wonder I've noticed that the cultivation speed of the world's cultivators is much faster than before. A new path is about to appear. A transcendent expert muttered. I also feel that my cultivation has become much smoother. It's as if the original obstacles have weakened a lot. Another transcendent expert added. My heaven and earth is growing faster as well. One transcendent being after another spoke of the various anomalies that they had encountered. By sorting out their own situations and combining them with the situations of other transcendent beings, the appearance of the tribulations had also brought them some additional benefit. More and more people agreed with this judgment. If that's the case, perhaps we've already made it through the first phase of the tribulation, a supreme transcendent said with an indescribable expression. Tribulations could bring benefits, but this was not without preconditions. With their knowledge of cultivation and tribulations, they knew very well that the benefits of tribulations did exist. However, this benefit would not appear with the arrival of the tribulation. Instead, it would only appear after the tribulation was overcome. And now, they were in the midst of the endless heavenly tribulation, but the benefits had arrived. No matter how one looked at it, it was normal for them to have helped the endless heavenly tribulation pass through a portion of it. An indescribable joy appeared on the faces of the other supreme transcendents. They also came to a similar conclusion. And to them, this was the greatest encouragement. Why had they painstakingly opened up that battlefield? Why had they painstakingly arranged for so many salvation organizations to fight there? Wasn't it to reduce the damage they caused to the endless heavenly tribulation? Wasn't it to keep the endless heavenly tribulation away from it? Under such circumstances, there was suddenly evidence that they had achieved the first phase of their goal. They had taken the first step to keep the endless heavenly tribulation away from it. The feeling was self-evident. Suddenly, one of the supreme transcendents sighed. However, our path of transcendence might no longer exist. The hearts of the other supreme transcendents shook, and they frowned slightly. Soon, they began to test each other. After this test, they all sighed inwardly. Indeed, they could sense the path of transcendence with just a thought. But now, they could not sense it at all. At this moment, they could no longer find any way to transcend and leave the endless heavenly tribulation. It was as if they had not reached the requirement to transcend and leave the endless heavenly tribulation. Suddenly, one of the supreme transcendents smiled and said, "As expected, this new path is correct." His expression was filled with excitement. Many transcendent experts also reacted at this time. What exactly was going on? This situation had happened several times before. Last time, it was when the second tribulation experts lost their chance to transcend and leave. The time before that, it was when the tribulation experts lost their chance to transcend and leave. Now, the third tribulation experts lost their chance to transcend. Compared to the previous two times, there was no difference in essence. It was because the endless heavenly tribulation's capacity had expanded, and this clearly meant that the endless heavenly tribulation had grown tremendously. Was this not a good thing? It seems that staying here was the right decision, one of the supreme transcendents said. To all the transcendents present, they had given up on the chance to transcend and stayed behind. Given their choices, even if they lost the chance to transcend and leave the boundless world, it wouldn't affect them in any fundamental way. After all, they would not choose to transcend even if they could. In comparison, they were more concerned about the meaning behind not being able to transcend. They had stayed in the endless heavenly tribulation because they were reluctant to part with their own world and the endless heavenly tribulation. It was because there were too many things they were reluctant to part with that they had given up their chance to transcend and leave. But now that the chance to transcend had disappeared, it meant that the endless heavenly tribulation had grown. To them, this was naturally something worth celebrating. Next, the supreme transcendents did not waste any time and immediately began to organize the path they had taken. They used the connections between the heavens and earth to share it and spread it to all the supreme transcendent. This was almost selfless sharing. Naturally, it was not because they were selfless or selfless. The reason why they shared it was because they knew that it was impossible to hide this path. With so many supreme transcendents, who did not have a few friends, who did not have friends of the same path, could it be that every single one of them would completely conceal this path? It was clear that most of them would do so, but there would definitely be people who would pass on this path to their friends of the same path. As long as such a transcendent expert appeared, the path forward would be known to all the other transcendent experts. After all, how could there not be such friends and friends of the same path? If you passed it on to your friends, they would pass it on to their friends, and friends would pass it on to their friends. In the end, everyone would know. In this way, by hiding this path forward, it was obvious that it was impossible for them to truly monopolize this path. At most, they would just delay the time when other supreme transcendents learned of this path. But, for those who had transcended, what did time count for? A few hundred years, a few thousand years, or even tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of millions of years, were all insignificant to them. Concealing this path for this little bit of time would ultimately incur the resentment and dissatisfaction of the supreme transcendents who learned of this path, because they were too slow. This was clearly not worth the loss. If one day another path appeared, but they were slowed down by this dissatisfaction and others learned of this path, then it would be a great loss. In comparison, directly publicizing this path would allow everyone to obtain it at the same time and have everyone owe them a favor. Wouldn't that be much better than having those cultivators be dissatisfied with them? It was precisely because of this consideration that they chose to be impartial at this time. Of course, in reality, this had already become the basic principle for many supreme transcendents to interact with each other. The previous road expansions were also announced in such a selfless manner, even if they didn't consider the pros and cons. Just the fact that they had accepted the impartiality of others meant that they had to be impartial now. After publicizing this path, these supreme transcendents didn't waste any more time and began to diligently cultivate in their own world. Although they had publicized this path, it didn't mean that they had lost their advantage. The founders and the learners were completely different. As the pioneers of this path, it would be many times easier for them to walk this path compared to those who had learned it. If the other transcendent beings needed to overcome 100 difficulties before they could truly walk on that path, then they only needed to overcome 10 difficulties to walk on that path. Of course, this was only an assumption. In reality, from a third tribulation to a fourth tribulation, there were more than 100 difficulties. As for how many difficulties they had to overcome, it depended on the cultivation path of these supreme transcendents. After all, this path of advancement only told them how to sublimate their own cultivation path and how to progress further within the framework of their own cultivation path. There was no specific cultivation method to tell them how to use their divine abilities, how to use their power, and how to push their own essence to achieve a breakthrough. After obtaining this path, what they knew was only equivalent to a direction. As for how to do it, they had to combine it with their own way of cultivation and their own ideas. They had to create it bit by bit and perfect it bit by bit in order to be able to do it. In this way, it would be up to them to decide what kind of difficulties they would encounter in the process of cultivation. Perhaps some cultivators only needed to overcome 1 or 2 difficulties to become a fourth tribulation powerhouse. Perhaps some cultivators had a longer path of cultivation and needed to overcome thousands of difficulties before they could reach the fourth tribulation. But none of this was certain. Perhaps some cultivators had a longer cultivation path and needed to overcome thousands of difficulties to become a fourth tribulation powerhouse. This was all uncertain. As such, even if these founders had such a great advantage, whether they could become the first to become a fourth tribulation powerhouse would depend on luck. After all, as the pioneer of this path, it would be quite embarrassing if he was unable to be the first to break through in the end. After all, as the founders of this path, if they couldn't be the first to break through, it would be somewhat embarrassing. Due to the appearance of this new path, the endless world was much more peaceful than before. After all, with the appearance of a brand new path, both third tribulation experts and non-third tribulation experts would need to reorganize their cultivation paths according to this path. After all, with the appearance of a new path, whether it was a third tribulation powerhouse or a non-third tribulation powerhouse, they all needed to reorganize their cultivation paths according to this path. If it wasn't for the fact that they needed to constantly protect the fog outside the battlefield, they might have even stopped their basic communication. If it wasn't for the fact that they needed to support the fog outside the battlefield at all times, they might have even stopped communicating. Not only did the Great Tao runes appear faster, but the Great Tao runes also became more and more complicated as time passed. The reason for this was very obvious. It was because when those who had transcended reorganized their own paths of cultivation, their own cultivation realm was constantly improving and improving. Because of the increase in their cultivation realm, the defensive augmentation methods they used naturally became more and more brilliant. Just like this, after a few hundred years, the Great Tao runes in the fog finally formed a balance with the destruction caused by the various impacts leaking out of the battlefield. And at this time, the level of the Great Tao runes had also decreased to a relatively dangerous level. The establishment of this balance was extremely important to the stability of the fog, or rather, to the continuation of the defensive formation. And the moment this balance was established, the situation underwent a huge change. It could be said that when the balance was established, it meant that the threat of the battlefield to the endless world had been weakened to the point where it was almost non-existent. Chapter 3157. The development of the situation was not unexpected. As time passed, it became harder and harder for the shock waves leaking out of the battlefield to affect the fog around the battlefield. At the beginning, when the balance was established, the shock waves could still destroy the Grand Tao runes in the fog. But as more and more transcendents set foot on the path to the fourth tribulation, the nature of the runes of the Great Tao they were buffed with started to improve. Their buffing ability on the mist also became stronger and stronger, and the impact they could withstand naturally became stronger and stronger. Just like that, after hundreds and thousands of years, the endurance of the Tao runes finally surpassed the destructive limit of the impact that leaked out from the battlefield at a certain moment. The result was that from then on, no matter how strong the shockwaves leaking out of the battlefield were, the fog would only ripple slightly, and it would no longer cause all sorts of mysterious scenes like before. Facing such a change, the transcendents outside the battlefield finally felt relieved. At this moment, they finally confirmed that the endless world outside the battlefield had passed the endless world tribulation. What they needed to do next was to wait. When the result of the battle in the battlefield came out, when the last remnant of the tribulation gradually calmed down, the endless world would have passed the tribulation. Without this worry, they had more information to use on their own cultivation, and their cultivation became even smoother. In the end, tens of millions of years after the path to becoming a fourth tribulation expert was sorted out, the first transcendent expert of the fourth tribulation level finally appeared. In just a short period of 10 million years, he had broken through to the next level. This speed could be said to be heaven-defying. However, those who had transcended did not feel that there was anything wrong with this kind of breakthrough speed. Every time a new Tao was discovered, a transcendental being would quickly appear who had taken this Tao and achieved a breakthrough. Although the 10 million years this time was much faster than the previous times, compared to the short time between the first path's appearance, this time was actually very long. When the first transcendent expert of the fourth tribulation level appeared, the entire world began to tremble indescribably. As the tremble spread, the battlefield suddenly erupted with heaven-shaking rumbles. As the rumbles echoed, countless cracks appeared on the battlefield. Unimaginable shock waves poured out from the cracks and rushed into the endless fog around the battlefield. They stirred the fog, causing the runes of the great Tao that had been hidden for millions of years to flash madly. Then, after flashing madly, they were quickly destroyed by the shockwaves. Clearly, the strength of the shockwaves had surpassed the tolerance of the grand Tao runes in the fog. As this change appeared, the various influences on the battlefield began to reveal their true nature. It seemed to be a kind of shock wave, but in essence, it was just an appearance formed by the fusion of countless strange influences. If it was really broken down, it could even be broken down into countless divine abilities, endless strange powers, and all kinds of unbelievable powers. There were even all kinds of spells, all kinds of lights, and all kinds of incomparably strange and indescribable existences that would terrifyingly corrode just by hearing their names. At this moment, as the shock waves broke through the grand Tao runes in the fog, the endless existences hidden in the shock waves finally began to break down. They either began to produce all sorts of terrifying effects in the fog, or they tried their best to charge out of the fog and affect the endless world. Not long after, the fog seemed to turn into an endless world, a world and a spacetime that displayed endless unbelievable light and shadows. There were even unimaginably strange sounds. This is the last wave. At this moment, all the transcendents understood what was going on. This was clearly the last wave of the endless tribulation. After this wave of explosion, no matter how great the impact on this boundless world was, whether it would completely destroy this boundless world or be easily blocked by the power of this boundless world tribulation would completely dissipate. In other words, this meant that there wasn't much time left before the endless tribulation truly disappeared. At this moment, how could the transcendents dare to be careless? At that moment, boundless power began to frantically gather towards the battlefield from many worlds. This power surged through the void, emitting all sorts of subtle splendor, making each strand of power look like a beam of light. At this moment, endless power erupted from all over the endless world and gathered at the battlefield. In an instant, the fog around the battlefield turned into a sun. It was an incomparably huge sun that emitted endless light. It was so huge that every part of the endless world seemed to have its own reflection in the void. At this moment, all the living beings in the endless world suddenly discovered that two suns had suddenly appeared in the sky. One was the sun they were familiar with, the sun that had cycled in their world for billions of years. The other one was 10 times bigger than the one they were familiar with. They felt a piercing pain in their eyes just by looking at it. It was as if their vision had been completely destroyed. Fortunately, the sudden appearance of this sun quickly triggered the natural defense mechanism of the world. Very quickly, a power enveloped the sun and weakened its light to a level that all living beings could bear. This prevented all the living beings in the endless world from losing their vision. However, it was clear that all of this was relying on the natural defense mechanism of the world. At this moment, none of the transcendents had the time to pay attention to such a trivial matter in their own world. At this moment, all the transcendents were wholeheartedly focused on defending against the various effects that leaked out from the battlefield. At this moment, the battlefield seemed to be releasing all the power of the world and the power of all the organizations that had entered it, bringing about an unimaginable impact on the outside world. The surroundings of the battlefield looked like fog, but in essence, it was a defensive formation formed by the transcendents outside. Under this kind of release, it was like a piece of paper that was torn apart layer by layer without any ability to resist. The appearance of this was that the countless layers of great Tao runes that existed in the fog were collapsing layer by layer. Countless fragments of great Tao runes were being pushed out of the fog by the impact and turned into specks of power runes that dissipated into the endless void between the heavens and earth. At this moment, the power gathered by the transcendents poured into the fog to repair the damage suffered by the fog and replenish the grand Tao runes. This time, these grand Tao runes were no longer directly buffed by the grand Tao runes in the fog. It was not like the beginning, where they were just increasing the foundation of the grand Tao runes. Instead, he directly appeared at the very front, at the front line of the endless impact that leaked out from the battlefield. He directly repaired the collapsed runes of the great Tao, and did his best to block the terrifying impact that leaked out from the battlefield. This method could not be said to be ineffective. However, it was clear that the instant effect was not something that could be imagined. The infusion of this boundless power only slowed down the expansion of the impact that was leaking out. There was still a long way to go before it could truly be stopped. At this moment, a figure of light that was different from the other endless powers shot out from somewhere in the endless world toward the battlefield. In the blink of an eye, it arrived outside the fog around the battlefield. It was not power, but a cultivator, a transcendent that all the other transcendent cultivators were familiar with. It was none other than the transcendent cultivator who sorted out the path for a third tribulation cultivator to reach the fourth tribulation. However, he was no longer a three-tribulation cultivator like he was before. But now, he was a true fourth tribulation expert. His strength was more than 10,000 times stronger than when he was a third tribulation cultivator. At this moment, the sense of existence that flowed out from his body was so strong that even across the endless world, all the transcendent cultivators couldn't help but focus most of their attention on him. Clearly, this transcendent had seized the opportunity and was the first to step into the fourth tribulation realm before all the other transcendent. He was the pioneer of the transcendent transcendents who were born and raised in this world. Although it's only the beginning and still needs a long time to stabilize and grow, dealing with the current situation shouldn't be a problem. The transcendent cultivator floated outside the fog and thought to himself. With this thought, he suddenly raised his hand and slapped the fog in front of him. In an instant, endless light burst out from his body. This light was so bright and dazzling that it even surpassed the light formed by the endless power of the world. Of course, this was only the brightness. In the end, he was only a single transcendent cultivator. Although he was a fourth tribulation cultivator, his size was still much smaller than a part of the world. There was no need to even mention comparing him to the combined power of the endless world. Although the fog in front of him was not the convergence of all the power of the world, just a small portion of the power of the world gathered together was already far greater than the power of a fourth tribulation cultivator. Therefore, his light was not as bright as the light from the fog in front of him. However, in terms of size and mass, it was still much smaller than the light from the fog. If the light from the fog was a huge sun, then the light from this fourth tribulation cultivator was only as bright as a light bulb that was comparable to the sun. In the eyes of all living beings in the endless world, this was like a second sun that suddenly had a bright spot around it. It was like a small star that suddenly appeared around the sun in the daytime, but the sunlight couldn't cover its radiance. The light emitted by this transcendent being at the fourth tribulation level was mixed with countless runes, divine abilities, power, and other indescribable and unimaginable existences. Although these existences looked heterogeneous, they were combined in an unimaginable and ingenious way. They complemented each other, promoted each other, and ascended together. The final result was that the combined power of the whole was tens of thousands of times stronger than the sum of their individual powers. At this moment, as he moved, these existences rushed towards the fog in front of him along with the light he gave off. In the blink of an eye, it had permeated the entire mist, and it was practically boundless. It had brought all the grand Tao talismans, all the energy, all the fluctuations, all the divine abilities, all the techniques, all the might, and even all the other indescribable existences within the mist into its grasp. It was to the extent that even the various incredible existences that leaked out from the battlefield could not truly escape his control at this moment. Under his influence, they began to undergo various subtle changes. However, it was clear that this fourth tribulation cultivator did not have such delusions about completely controlling the existences that leaked out of the battlefield. After all, those were existences that had been created by the power of tribulations. Even though he was already a fourth tribulation cultivator, he could not compare to those existences in essence. It was impossible for him to completely control those existences. It was already quite rare for him to be able to slightly influence those existences with this kind of control. His true focus was naturally the endless power, might, spells, divine abilities, and other indescribable existences that came from the endless world. In an instant, he felt as if his body had suddenly expanded by hundreds of millions of times. An indescribable feeling of power surged into his heart. This was none other than the feeling that he was controlling. The feeling that the indescribable existences from the endless world gave him could be said to be an illusion. After this feeling appeared, he did not hesitate at all. He directly controlled the countless existences to reconstruct them according to his will. Chapter 31:58. These existences, which were gathered from millions and millions of transcendents, were naturally inconceivably terrifying in terms of quantity. However, most of them were only evolved under the control of transcendent cultivators below the third tribulation. As a result, their overall structure was only at the level of a third tribulation cultivator at most. Compared to the infinite beings that had gathered here, this level was clearly equivalent to using the technology used to make lighters to make nuclear bombs. Clearly, the true potential of these existences had not been unleashed at all. Under such circumstances, the fourth tribulation master's current action was to eliminate this weakness of these existences. He used his fourth tribulation master's cultivation realm to control these existences, to construct a structure that could better utilize these existences' potential, and to stimulate these existences' greater potential. Even though a fourth tribulation expert was still extremely weak compared to these endless existences, and the structure formed from their cultivation realm was still incomparably far from being able to unleash the full potential of these existences. But in the end, it was still able to unleash the potential of these existences better than the structure formed from the combined efforts of most transcendents who were below the third tribulation expert level originally, The ones who should be taking action at this time were the sixth tribulation cultivators. The sixth tribulation cultivators themselves were tens of millions of times stronger than the fourth tribulation cultivators, even billions of times stronger. In that case, they could reconstruct these existences with their own cultivation level, which would naturally stimulate the potential of these existences even more closely. In fact, it was not impossible to unleash all of these existences' potential. However, even though the sixth tribulation cultivators had also participated in this endless world's tribulation, they were still separated from this endless world. It was not only because they were outsiders and not native cultivators of this endless world, but also because they clearly knew that this tribulation was tens of thousands of times more threatening to them than to the other transcendent cultivators of this endless world. Although the native transcendent cultivators of this endless world would also be affected by the endless world's tribulation and even be controlled by it, they were a part of this endless world. It could even be said that they were an extension of this endless world. Therefore, this tribulation still had its limit. In other words, no matter how strong the tribulation was, it was only limited to an acceptable level. Just like the organizations of salvation in the battlefield. Even though they'd fallen under the control of the tribulation, they'd only been affected no matter what, and not a single one of them had been completely assimilated by the tribulation to become a part of its source. This was a sign that the tribulations had a sense of propriety. In comparison, these sixth tribulation experts were clearly different. They were foreign cultivators. Although they had been accepted by the islands and the endless world, they were still a part of the endless world. However, no matter what, they were still cut off from the boundless world. The most obvious difference was that the path of cultivation in this endless world had only been opened up to the level of a fourth tribulation cultivator, and it had only recently been opened up to this level. And the cultivation of those sixth tribulation experts had clearly far surpassed this level. And this was only one of the many. Apart from this extremely obvious division, there were even more divisions. Under normal circumstances, all of this was nothing at all. It would not have too obvious of an effect on the boundless world or themselves. However, it was clear that these normal circumstances didn't include the endless world that was in the midst of a tribulation. This tribulation was a test for the endless world. For the endless world to truly stabilize, for it to truly grow, and for it to truly be recognized by the state of chaos, this tribulation was unavoidable. If one were to make an analogy, the state of chaos accepting the endless world was equivalent to a school accepting a certain student. And the tribulation was equivalent to the school's test for the student. That's right, when you entered the school, you were already a student of the school. However, this didn't mean that you would be able to sit back and relax. What awaited you next would be test after test, test after test. If you passed the test, or even got full marks, that would naturally be for the best. The school would continue to recognize you as a student. There might even be rewards, however, if you failed the test. Unless it was compulsory education, you might even be expelled. At this time, this was the case for the endless world. When the endless world was controlled by the overall latent consciousness of the transcendent, the path of Tao Master, or the state of chaos, had already accepted it. Using the analogy just now, this school that was in a state of chaos had already accepted the identity of endless heaven and earth as its student. And at this time, the endless world tribulation was a test for the endless world. This test was obviously testing the growth speed of the endless world. It was testing whether the growth speed was fast enough, and whether the growth method was healthy enough. If it didn't grow fast enough and wasn't healthy enough, the school might just expel it. If the endless world was a student, then the transcendent native to the endless world was equivalent to the real knowledge and real power of the student. Naturally, the test would never restrict the use of this real knowledge and real power. In fact, they even wished that this real knowledge and real power could be used to create a flower. In contrast, the six tribulation experts, who were obviously separated from the transcendent native to the endless world, were obviously different. This kind of existence was like a book in a closed book exam, like a calculator in a math exam, like a tutor in a tutoring institution outside. This kind of existence could naturally be used at will at other times. Even if you used some despicable means to suck it dry, it would only be encouraged, not criticized. However, this kind of thing was definitely not allowed to appear in the examination or during the test. Ordinary schools would directly expel it from the examination room after it appeared. But some schools would directly include it in the calculation of the difficulty of the test after it appeared. That was to say, the original difficulty was only a test for the student. It was only a test for the situation where there were no books, calculators, or tutors. However, if these books, calculators, and tutors appeared in the examination room, it would have to directly redesign the test for the situation where these books, calculators, and tutors were present. Obviously, such a change would not only greatly increase the difficulty of the test, but the things brought into the examination room would also be subjected to a test that had nothing to do with them. At this time, to the endless world, the 6 tribulation experts were like existences that should not have appeared in the examination room. Originally, this test should not have much to do with them. The level of this endless world's tribulation should not be too high. However, if they were to actively participate in it, everything would change drastically. Not only would the intensity of the endless world's tribulation soar by 1,000 times, but even they themselves would have to endure a test that was equivalent to their level. Compared to when they had been watching coldly from the sidelines, where the level of the endless heavenly tribulations was only at the current level, and they themselves had only encountered a test similar to those who had transcended the 3 tribulations. Clearly, there was a world of difference between the two. Obviously, not many of the 6 tribulation experts could truly understand the essence of this. However, just because they did not understand it did not mean that they did not know what to do. Even if they did not understand what was going on, they were still 6 tribulation experts after all. They had cultivated from ordinary living beings until they could easily destroy the world and split the world apart. For people like them, the sense of danger had almost become an instinct. They might not be able to explain clearly what might bring them danger and what actions might bring them benefits, but they would definitely have some sort of feeling. In the face of this endless world's tribulation, their feeling was clearly telling them that if they got too involved, what awaited them would be a disaster. Even if they were only clones, incarnations, or projections of true 6 tribulation experts, and the damage to their bodies did not have any intrinsic impact on their true bodies, this did not mean that they did not have a desire to live, nor did it mean that they felt that their lives could be casually abandoned. Perhaps this was their value to the real bodies. However, to the real bodies, their lives were their own lives. If they were to lose them, they would truly die. Under such circumstances, how could they be careless when faced with a choice that could bring about a disaster? It was precisely because of this that even the 6 tribulation experts did not truly understand what was said above, and not many people could truly explain what the possible dangers were. However, this did not prevent them from carefully limiting their strength during the long process of the endless world's tribulation. They did not stay too far away from the tribulation, nor did they overly participate in it. It was precisely because of this that the existence of these 6 tribulation experts was so weak ever since the outbreak of the endless world's tribulation. They were like ordinary transcendent experts in this endless world. They did not display a strong desire to make a move, nor did they display the knowledge and methods that a 6 tribulation expert should have. Therefore, at this time, the 6 tribulation experts clearly knew that as long as they made a move, they would be able to stimulate most of the unfathomable existence that came from the endless world's boundless world. Yet, none of them truly made a move. It was only when a 4 tribulation expert among the native transcendent experts personally made a move that this great waste was barely rectified. It was not that the native transcendent experts did not have any doubts about the 6 tribulation experts not actively making a move. It was just that their level was not high enough, and they did not know how unfathomable and powerful the 6 tribulation experts were. Therefore, they did not know how much strength they had. It was only because there were too few 6 tribulation experts, and their combined strength was insignificant compared to the endless world's tribulation. Even if they used their full strength, they would not be able to change the situation in this endless world. That was why they were not forced to make a move. Just how much did they pull? Even I could do this. If they really made a move, they would definitely be able to do it even more perfectly. At this time, outside the fog, the 4th tribulation cultivator, who was using his own cultivation realm to reconstruct the endless runes of the great Tao in the fog, reconstructing the inconceivable existence gathered by many transcendents, had such a thought flashed through his mind. Turned out that he was just like the other native transcendent experts. He thought that the 6 tribulation experts were just holding back a little, and did not really go easy on them. However, now that he had truly stepped into the level of a 4 tribulation expert, he knew that his guess might be a far cry from the truth. Even he, as an initial 4 tribulation expert, could stimulate so much of the gathered existence's potential, increasing their power by at least 10,000 times. If a real 6 tribulation expert were to make a move, how much more powerful would they be? At this moment, an indescribable resentment emerged from the bottom of his heart. If those 6 tribulation experts had used their full strength, this endless world would not have suffered such a great loss. Perhaps the endless world's tribulation would have been dealt with long ago. In the past, before the endless tribulation of the world had dissipated outside, just his resentment alone would have been enough to pull him into the endless tribulation of the world. He would have become the power of the endless tribulation of the world, and he would have become the existence that he feared, the existence that brought endless blows to the endless world. Fortunately, the endless world's tribulation had already gathered in the center of the fog. Outside the fog, it had mostly disappeared. At this moment, in the mist, endless runes of the great path appeared, forming all sorts of indescribable and strange things. It was as if an endless world of runes of the great path was being born. The scene looked incomparably mysterious. Chapter 3159. Along with these changes, the fog rapidly stabilized. At this time, the battlefield also gradually stabilized. To be more precise, the wreckage of the battlefield was gradually stabilizing. At the center of the mist, the battlefield had already shattered into countless fragments. Within those fragments, the supreme transcendents were looking around in bewilderment, as if they couldn't believe what had happened. It was clear that everything that had happened had exceeded their expectations. "What have we done?" one of the supreme transcendents murmured, his voice filled with regret. At this time, apart from the remnant fragments, everything in the battlefield had turned into unimaginable existences that bombarded the surrounding fog that had been reinforced by the countless runes of the Great Path. In the fog, the runes of the Great Path continued to collapse and regenerate. Endless light gathered from all directions to the places where the runes of the Great Path had collapsed, allowing the runes of the Great Path to recover as if time had been reversed. They once again stood in front of the endless existences of the battlefield. They were like dams that were constantly recovering, protecting the fog itself and everything around it. When the transcendent beings came back to their senses, they discovered that they were also in a precarious state. At this moment, the existence formed by the boundless battlefield did not let them off either. It was also charging towards them at all times. If it wasn't for the fragments around them withstanding the impact and destruction for them, their true bodies would have collapsed and their souls would have perished, leaving only a bit of spirit light to return to their own world. It was just like the supreme transcendents who hadn't appeared in the wreckage of the battlefield. If we really end up like that, then we'll probably sink for trillions of years before we can recover. The supreme transcendents couldn't help but panic when they thought of this outcome. For these supreme transcendents, their deaths weren't true deaths. At least, this was the case if only their true bodies died. After all, these supreme transcendents and their own world, which was also the source of their transcendence, had an extremely close connection. It was naturally an exaggeration to say that this connection was 1 to 2 and 2 to 1. However, it was not an exaggeration to say that heaven and earth were the sustenance of their bodies and minds. Therefore, there were two conditions to completely kill them. The first was to erase their true bodies. The second was to completely destroy the heaven and earth that was the foundation of those who had transcended. Only by completing these two steps could one truly kill the transcendent. As long as either of these two steps were not completed, the transcendent would be able to sleep in peace. If his true body hadn't been destroyed, then needless to say, he wouldn't have been injured at all. On the other hand, if their true bodies were destroyed, then the foundation of their transcendence would not be destroyed. That situation would be much worse than if their true bodies were not destroyed. However, they would still have a chance to come back. Because of the close connection between these transcendent beings and the world, a part of their existence was entrusted to the world. This part of existence usually only gave them unimaginable authority over heaven and earth. Once their true bodies were destroyed, then this part of existence would instantly become their last chance of survival. It would bring along a bit of their life force and enter the reincarnation cycle of heaven and earth, borrowing the power of reincarnation to be reborn. However, if that was the case, then it would be difficult to find everything that their true bodies had. After reincarnation, although their realms remained the same, all the power, strength, divine abilities, might, and everything else that their true bodies possessed would have to be cultivated anew in order to recover. Even if it was a tribulation stage powerhouse, even if they had their own cultivation as a foundation, it would take at least a few trillion years of cultivation day and night for them to recover from zero. In other words, once their true bodies died, it would be equivalent to wasting a few trillion years of development. This kind of loss was a huge price for those who had transcended. And this was without taking into account the consequences of the enemy's attack. If the enemy was included, then the result would be even more tragic. This was because before their cultivation realms recovered, the supreme transcendents were extremely weak. If the enemy took advantage of this opportunity to destroy the foundation of the supreme transcendents along with their true bodies, then what awaited them would be the destruction of their souls, never to be reincarnated. It was precisely because of this great danger that the supreme transcendents decided to open up a battlefield as their battlefield and have everyone enter the battlefield to determine the victor. Only then would it be acceptable for the salvation organizations. After all, even though death in the heavenly battlefield couldn't be considered as true death, death in the heavenly battlefield meant that one was only a step away from death. But once he won, he would be able to easily push past that one step. This was what they thought when they faced the endless tribulations of the world. At this moment, they began to rejoice over their initial thoughts. It was precisely because they had such thoughts that they could still turn the situation around. Fortunately. If I didn't leave a way out, my sins would be great. The supreme transcendents more or less had similar thoughts. Because of these thoughts, they felt much more at ease. Some of them didn't even intend to use their own power to support the fragment of the battlefield they were in. They simply allowed the other existences in the battlefield to destroy the fragment of the battlefield they were in. Then, the unimaginable existences covered them and crushed them bit by bit like a stone mill grinding beans, causing their true bodies to perish completely. The ones who did this were the supreme transcendents, who felt that they no longer had any hope of escaping. At the same time, they felt extremely regretful for their previous actions. Of course, the number of such supreme transcendents was still relatively small. The remaining supreme transcendents might have regretted their actions in the battlefield and felt despair at their current situation, but they didn't lose their will to resist. They still did their best to resist the attacks from the various inconceivable existences in the battlefield. The end result was that after an unknown amount of time, the ruins of the battlefield were reduced to some faintly discernible transcendence of the sixth tribulation level, floating amidst the endless attacks and endless terror. As for the rest, those who hadn't reached the sixth tribulation, they were all completely annihilated by the various existences on the battlefield. At this moment, a supreme transcendent at the sixth tribulation level said, "The tribulation should be completely over. We can't take the risk. Although it feels like it's over, the aftershocks of the final attacks still haven't disappeared. If we take action now, we might fall short of success." Another supreme transcendent at the sixth tribulation sighed. In the endless tribulations of the world, these supreme transcendents felt extreme pressure. As supreme transcendents, they had no choice but to participate in the endless tribulations of the world. They had no choice but to play their roles according to the requirements of the endless tribulations of the world. They had to fight, scheme, and kill. However, due to the reasons mentioned earlier, they couldn't use their full strength. They had to restrain their own strength, their own cultivation, their own abilities, and their own might. They couldn't use methods that were too powerful, lest they incite the endless tribulations of the world and bring misfortune to the endless world and themselves. In a situation like this where they had to act but couldn't display too much strength, every choice they made was a choice of great importance. If they weren't careful, they might encounter a horror that they didn't want to encounter. It went without saying how oppressive this situation was. If these supreme transcendents weren't extremely familiar with the endless world and had a tacit understanding with each other, they wouldn't have been able to smoothly complete this tribulation without any mistake. However, this kind of oppression left quite a few repercussions on their bodies. For example, when faced with the remnant effects of the battlefield that they could easily eliminate with just a single move, they actually didn't know whether they should take action or not. Forget it, let's just wait like this. They can take care of it anyway. At most, they'll just waste a bit more time. Another supreme transcendent sighed and said. His words received the approval of all the other supreme transcendent. Clearly, if they took action now, they would at most save a bit of time. However, the risk was so great that all of them would be killed. The rewards and risks were clearly not proportional. Since that was the case, was there any need to say more about what to do? After this conversation, the existence of these supreme transcendents became even closer to non-existent. Their influence on the fog had been weakened to the point where it was almost non-existent. Aside from the supreme transcendents at the level of 4 transcendents, the other supreme transcendents almost didn't notice their choice. The other supreme transcendents couldn't truly understand how powerful and inconceivable these supreme transcendents were. As a result, they had the wrong feeling and thought that the supreme transcendents had all died due to the series of upheavals. Only the transcendent experts at the level of the 4th tribulation clearly knew how powerful the 6th tribulation experts were after clearly sensing their own strength. They were sure that the 6th tribulation experts wouldn't suffer any real damage from the series of upheavals that happened just now. As a result, they were certain that the supreme transcendents weren't dead, but were just hiding. Although they didn't know why the supreme transcendents had been so lenient in the previous endless tribulations, the supreme transcendents weren't fools and could guess that they had no choice but to do so. As a result, they acted as if they didn't notice this and just quietly manipulated the endless existences in the fog to eliminate the remnants of the battlefield as much as possible. The remnant of the battlefield came from countless heavens and earth, so the destructive power had naturally reached an unimaginable level. It was obviously not an easy task to eliminate it. Even if the power controlled by the supreme transcendents came from countless worlds, it was the same for the supreme transcendents. However, the battlefield had already collapsed in the end. The remnants of the battlefield had become water without a source, a tree without roots. If they resisted a bit, they would weaken a bit. If they eliminated a bit, they would weaken a bit. In this way, so long as he was able to resist the first wave of impact, then it would only be a matter of time before the remnants of the battlefield were completely eliminated. For the supreme transcendence at the level of 4 transcendence, he had far too much time. As a result, he waited in this position for nearly 100,000 years. Relying on his incomparable patience, he finally eliminated all the remnants of the battlefield. When all the remnants were eliminated, this transcendent expert of the 4th tribulation level felt his body lighten, and an indescribable feeling of enlightenment appeared in his heart out of nowhere. Amidst this feeling, he vaguely felt the power of his abilities, as well as his understanding of all things in the world, the endless world, and even the primordial chaos. All of them began to rise bit by bit. As all of this rose, his cultivation realm also began to rise bit by bit. After an unknown amount of time, when all of these changes ended, his cultivation realm had completely reached the peak of the 4th tribulation. In just a few 100,000 years, he had reached the peak of the 4th tribulation. The speed of his improvement was so fast that it could be said to be in defiance of the natural order. However, if one considered the gifts from passing the tribulations, this speed of improvement was only natural. Congratulations, congratulations! At this moment, a large number of 6th tribulation experts appeared before the 4th tribulation expert out of nowhere, and such words rang out. When the 4th tribulation expert heard the voices, he returned to his senses. When he saw the 6th tribulation experts, his expression became complicated. Thank you, thank you. After a long time, he sighed and suppressed all the doubts he had about them before thanking them.